Chapter 56, Conquerors and Visiting Day. Point of view narration. Enel and Domino traveled all the way down to the lowest level rather quickly. Enel was already somewhat familiar with the levels thankfully. But he could only vaguely remember them at first. However, he wanted to have some understanding of Impel Down as he wanted to keep it as a plan B. If he failed to befriend enough powerful pirates and the Revolutionary Army, then he'd just free the entirety of Impel Down and create a fleet powerful enough to stand on its own. Of course, Enel planned to keep Blackbeard's associates alive for that plan as they were all rather useful for that plan B. He would make sure they were captured again and sent back to Impel Down. Enel remembered Buggy becoming an emperor. He couldn't quite remember the circumstances of how that had happened, but he knew that it was likely also thanks to the Impel Down prisoners that he had scammed into believing in him. Enel could do what Buggy did. But he'd actually have the strength to back up his words if a fight were to break out. Enel still wasn't sure how Buggy had managed to rule his crew so efficiently, but he decided not to think about it too much. If anything, Buggy could also become a powerful ally in the future if the stars aligned. Domino was confident in herself as she showed the unranked admiral all over the prison, explaining everything from the soldiers defending each level to the way they handled any possible breakouts. Domino seemed extremely confident in the prison's defense systems. To the point where she even seemed prideful. Enel just whistled a bit as he wondered how the world had aligned itself for Luffy to be able to escape with so many prisoners. It was a wonder, but Enel decided not to think about it too much. He'd leave Luffy to it. The last level, however, was where things got a bit more interesting. Enel could feel quite a few prisoners locked up inside it. It was rather normal compared to all of the contrived methods of punishment that the other levels had. There was no punishment in the last level. It was just a regular jail made out of sea stone mostly. It was a prison that housed the most powerful pirates, unlike the last level, the Freezing Hell, which only housed pirates with bounties of over 100 million. In truth, the Eternal Hell housed the most dangerous pirates only. The type that could endanger entire kingdoms with their presence. Doflamingo would have ended up somewhere in there, had Enel not derailed the story the way he did. The jail was a lot larger than Enel had thought it would be though. Which made quite a bit of sense. There were hundreds of pirates in that last level, all of which powerful and devious in their own right. Enel could feel members of the Blackbeard pirates with his observation hockey, still shackled and sitting down on the cold floor. Although there was no physical torture in the last level of Impel Down, it was made to look extremely bland. It was created to drive the residents crazy. In truth, it didn't do much as the vast majority of people that reached that level were already insane. Enel could see Hancock walking in front of him. She was being led by Hannibal, the current vice warden. Enel chuckled a bit as he noticed that she had been cuffed. He forgot just how little the warlords were trusted. They were supposedly allies, but they were still being treated as pirates. That treatment might have been accurate though. Enel could remember Hancock turning many Marines to stone a long time before the warlords were disbanded. If the warlords themselves didn't see the Marines or world government as allies, then why would the other party bother? Hancock heard Enel chuckle. She turned around and narrowed her eyes at the Rear Admiral. She simply scoffed and turned around. "And why exactly are you following me?" she asked in her usual haughty tone, making Domino blush a bit. "I was just sightseeing. I wouldn't be looking at you if I had any other choice. Unfortunately, there isn't anything else down here," Enel said as he studied the young pirate empress with a bored gaze. "Fee." She once again scoffed and turned around. It seemed that not even sea stone cuffs were able to suppress her arrogance, which made Enel smile a bit in amusement. "Hurry up and do what you have to do. We need to get to Marineford sometime this week," Enel said as he ignored whatever the prisoners around him were sputtering out. He could hear literal howls as Hancock walked by the cells, making him feel a bit weirded out. Being beautiful sure is tough. Good thing I never have to worry about that. Enel pondered to himself as he walked up near Hancock, walking slightly behind her, his cape attracting quite a few laughs from the prisoners. "A Rear Admiral. Wahahaha. What's a shrimp like him doing here?" The dogs barked pretty loudly, making Hannibal whip the loudest one to make an example out of him. Sorry about that, Rear Admiral Enel. Prisoners down here probably have no idea who you are, so things like these can happen," Hannibal said as he bowed his head slightly. Enel simply shook his head. Couldn't care less. Hancock was rather satisfied to hear that Enel was being ridiculed though, at least Enel could tell that much from her melodic laughter. "Damn. What a bitch. Enel thought to himself as he released a wave of Conqueror's Haki, sweeping over all of the cells nearby and knocking out everyone that had been mocking him. A deadly silence descended upon the prison, as the stronger pirates weren't the types to badmouth someone with Conqueror's Haki. Hancock also turned around again when the wave of Haki washed over her. It startled her slightly, as Enel didn't even seem remotely serious, yet he was able to knock out people on the 6th level of Impel Down. Such a feat would have been difficult for most, but Enel seemed completely fine. Enel raised an eyebrow though. For some reason, he felt a bit drained from using his Conqueror's Haki. This was something he had also experienced during his training, but he assumed it was just due to the fact that he was overusing it. In truth, after testing it a few times, the more Enel used Conqueror's Haki, the less he could use it. He thought it was going to be alright after resting a bit after his month-long training. He had been using it quite a bit when training. But it seemed that the resting time had changed nothing at all. The willpower itself was getting stronger the more he used it, but it was as if Enel's reserves were limited, and either replenishing really slowly or not at all. Enel simply clenched his fist and continued to walk forward, deciding to not use Conquerors anymore until he looked further into the issue. Enel knew that it was time for Hancock to speak to Ace, so he beckoned Hannibal to whip a random prisoner, while Domino stayed there to cheer on him. Those were the actual instructions Enel gave her. Hancock went ahead and spoke with Ace. Enel didn't greet Ace during that time, but Ace's cellmate managed to catch his attention. A rear admiral that possesses the will of a conqueror. Something isn't right here. The fishman looked up at Enel with narrowed eyes. Enel simply tilted his head, his earlobes swaying a bit as he looked at the imprisoned warlord. Same could be said about someone of your strength letting themselves get captured. I get not agreeing to orders, but actually being imprisoned. Enel said as he also narrowed his eyes. A fishman. Pirate like Jimby would always be difficult to catch. In water, he was simply impossible to catch. He'd be able to escape even if an admiral showed up as long as he dived deep enough underwater, and the Marines wouldn't be able to do anything. Jimby and Enel stared at one another for a bit, at least until they both heard steps going in another direction. Hancock had finished telling Ace that Luffy was coming to save him, which gained its own set of concerned hushed whispers from Ace. The pirate empress then left the prison, the vice warden following after her like a little dog. Welp. See you at the war, folks. Enel told both Jimby, who raised an eyebrow, and Ace, who didn't pay attention, and was still thinking about his brother putting himself in danger to rescue him. Domino. Please make sure that Hancock waits for me at the docks. I will be out soon. Enel said as he turned around and walked in the opposite direction of the exit. Domino had wanted to protest and follow Enel further in but was dissuaded by his cold gaze, so she turned around and ran after Hannibal. Enel sighed as he was finally left alone. He walked all the way over to Shiria, who had been the head jailer until recently. He was imprisoned for repeatedly slaughtering prisoners, and he didn't seem to care too much. The man was simply smoking his cigar, sitting down cross-legged as he didn't even bother wearing prisoner garb, still wearing his jailer uniform. To what do I owe the honor? Unranked Admiral. Shiria asked, his eyes hidden by his cap as Enel stared at him with cold eyes. Oh. Didn't think my reputation made it down here. I guess Magellan keeps you posted on those things. Enel said as he shook his head a bit. I'm not here for that though. You will soon be presented with a choice, Shiria. I want you to know that if you accept it, you are the only one I won't spare. Enel didn't bother to elaborate, only turning around and leaving behind a confused Shiria. What the hell was that about? The former head jailer asked himself as he wiped some sweat from his brow. And with that, Enel's business at Impel Down had concluded. Chapter 57 Annoyance and Purity. Point of view narration. Enel didn't spend more time in the lower levels of Impel Down after giving Shiria that warning. It was true that Enel planned to take a part of Blackbeard's crew if things didn't work out. But Shiria and Blackbeard were the two people that Enel planned to kill. Blackbeard's death was needed for Enel's plan to work out, and Shiria was a person with a track record of betraying authority, someone that Enel knew he wouldn't be able to lead. All of the pirates in Blackbeard's future crew were sadistic and vile, but Shiria was especially so, as he also happened to be an actual psychopath. Enel had pondered his future options many times, and he found himself unable to relate to or associate with people like Shiria. He didn't care if the people he hung around were villains, or if they were particularly immoral. As long as he could use them, then it was all equaled out in the end. However, Enel simply didn't know if he could reliably use someone like Shiria. And since Shiria was also not an enjoyable company, Enel had no reason to even attempt to keep him around. Inside, he hoped that the former head jailer would take his advice to heart and not join up with Blackbeard. Blackbeard was a tricky person, so Enel figured he'd probably find a way to escape Impel Down even without Shiria's help. But, in the end, it wouldn't matter either way. Both of them would simply become just two more corpses littering the grounds of Marineford during the upcoming Summit War. At least Enel was able to scout out the prison a bit. He thankfully also didn't need to care about having an escape plan after leaving the prison, as the gates of justice couldn't hold him back in any way. Enel could easily fly over them, or destroy them if it was truly needed. The Rear Admiral walked all the way back to his ship, not trying to look for Luffy and just letting the future play out as it was bound to. He didn't bother telling Magellan of his departure either, as he didn't want to speak to a toilet door. Hancock was already waiting for him at the docks. She looked at him with annoyance, as she had an angry scowl on her face when seeing him. "You sure took your time, Mister. We need to get to Marineford this week," she said while tilting her head backwards again. Enel didn't bother gratifying her childish jab with a response. He simply clapped his hands and rebuilt his boat, including his usual beach chair/throne. Hancock simply walked inside and entered her room below the deck, and Enel just did his own thing, grabbing a newspaper with his earlobes and randomly skimming through it while whistling. The rest of the journey should have gone rather quietly, or at least that was what Enel hoped. But Hancock seemed to have other things on her mind. Typical male. Lazing around all day and reading newspapers. Hancock stood by Enel's beach chair and started nagging him. "What do you want me to do? Speak to you?" Not horribly interested in that. Enel decided to answer, mostly out of boredom. They were currently a day away from Marineford, so he had some time left to waste with her. "Fee, why would I care what you are doing?" Hancock once again raised her chin up high as she seemed to think that she was somehow winning an argument. "Then why the fuck are we having this conversation?" Enel's cold and frustrated response was a bit different from what she was expecting though. The pirate empress was used to men always doing whatever they could to appeal to her, even Marines were the same. But Enel seemed to disregard her for sport. There was no appreciation to be found in his gaze as he stared at her, just annoyance. This behavior was what made Hancock want to talk more to Enel. But she wasn't exactly prone to making conversations, so they were stuck on her nagging him and him telling her to fuck off repeatedly. This went on for a bit until Enel started outright ignoring her. This only further exasperated problems, as Hancock made it her hourly mission to make fun of something about Enel. "What's with the earlobes? Are you some kind of religious freak? What a tacky suit. I hope you aren't expecting to impress anyone with that. What's with all of this gold? Showing off your wealth? Are you trying to compensate for something? Why is your stupid coat so stained? I guess there is no honor among Marines after all." Most of her jabs were answered by Enel turning a page to his newspaper. By the time they reached Marineford, Enel had read over the same newspaper well over 16 times, just so that he could efficiently ignore Hancock. Though he could still hear her. Maybe I should just throw her in the sea. He had had that thought quite a few times, but at least he had managed to control himself till the end. Enel landed in the middle of Marineford and started heading directly to Sengoku's office. Hancock followed suit, doing her best to get a response out of Enel. It was an odd sight for outsiders, the woman considered the most beautiful in the world dragging behind a rear admiral and being obviously ignored at every step of the way. Many of the Marines tried to approach her only to be turned to stone as she didn't like men getting close to her. Although, now that she also took a second to look at the situation a bit, she was technically the one pursuing Enel. Constantly. That thought made her stop in her tracks as if petrified by her own devil fruit. Enel also stopped, he turned around and waited for her to start walking again. He didn't know if she had any idea where Sengoku's office was, so he had to lead her there at least. "Get moving, Sengoku called for you," Enel said as he started walking slowly, waiting for the woman behind him to snap out of her daydreams. After noticing that she was simply not budging, Enel simply walked over to her, grabbed her wrist and started dragging her off. This did manage to break the Empress out of her stupor. She almost instantly tried to turn Enel to stone, only for her ability to fail. "What? Why isn't my Marrow beam not working on him?" Unfortunately for her, Enel was well past the age where he let his hormones control his thoughts. Although Hancock's appearance was beautiful, he had always been the type that would appreciate beauty, not lust after it. In the end, Hancock let herself be led by the wrist all the way to Sengoku's office while her thoughts were all over the place and she tried to wrap her head around the man that was dragging her around. She had tried to use her Marrow beam on Enel a few times. Enel just ignored the pink hearts that sometimes passed by his head, although he was getting a bit frustrated with them. If anything, one wouldn't be able to tell that Enel was dragging the most beautiful woman if one looked only at his face. He looked more like he was dragging around a sack of potatoes. Hancock simply gulped. She looked up at Enel, who easily towered over her, and she finally took her arm back. Enel didn't bother to hold her tightly, she could have broken off at any point, she had just been too flabbergasted to do that though. "Never touch me again," Hancock shouted, making Enel just shrug as he opened Sengoku's door, and proceeded to continue ignoring the Empress. Hancock simply narrowed her eyes as she thought to herself. Why is someone like him just as pure as my Luffy? A rather great misconception. Luffy was simply ignorant when it came to women, while Enel was simply uncaring. But the both of them did have something in common, both of them had greater concerns. Luffy was busy with his dream of becoming the Pirate King and currently rescuing his brother. Enel was busy with his own problems, as well as his plan of uncovering the world's secrets. Both of them were driven, but only Luffy could be called somewhat pure. Enel was rather the opposite. His age brought him experience. Hancock had no way of knowing that though, she was simply torn in her own little world. In the end, she walked into Sengoku's office with a cold gaze, and chose to not think about Enel anymore. He's just a marine anyway. Chapter 58 Calm Before the Storm. Point of view narration. Sengoku and Garp had been expecting Enel's arrival for a while now. Sengoku especially had prepared quite a few questions to ask Enel. Things like, why do you have conquerors haki? That was by far the most passive-aggressive one of his questions. The rest were mostly about Enel's well-being and the way his mission had gone. Sengoku was rather concerned due to the fact that Enel really seemed to have something against directly contacting him. The ironic thing was that Enel had only contacted him once, and Sengoku hadn't even been there to respond to it. Sakazuki had answered it, and the mess that Sengoku was somehow still cleaning up ensued. In truth, all of the officials that saw the recording of Enel's battle with Doflamingo were shocked. All but two people. Akainu and Garp simply nodded, saying that was somewhat within their expectations. The only thing that surprised them was the clash of conkers. Other than that, they expected Enel to just instantly kill Doflamingo. Akainu specifically complained that Enel had somewhat dragged that fight a bit as he had a few chances to catch Doflamingo with his sea stone staff before the clash of conquerors even happened. In truth, Akainu was rather pleased with Enel's handiwork. So pleased that he basically told both the Cypher Paul and the five elders to fuck off their faces when they had stated their plans to recruit Enel. It was the first time Sengoku had seen Akainu actively disrespect government officials. Thankfully nothing came out of it, but that stunt made the world government forget about turning Enel into an agent. At least openly. The secret mission of the two CP0 agents that Enel had mushed into the ground was to extend an invitation to Enel, which they were a bit too scared to complete. Not that they could have. Enel was well away from Dressrosa by the time the agents woke up after Enel's beating. In the end, the mission has simply been titled a failure, but the CP0 agents were at least able to confiscate the recording of Enel's fight and subsequently silence the journalist that had filmed it. This even managed to somewhat sour the already shitty relationship they had with Big News Morgan though, as the man they silenced was apparently employed by Morgan. Overall, the mission was a complete failure. The world government still secretly started pestering Sengoku about making Enel a CP0 agent as 2 spots had conveniently opened up very recently. This only added to Sengoku's already heavy workload. Sengoku didn't even have the time to worry about Big Mom starting a war, he was busy planning another war. It was an extremely stressful situation. And Garp didn't make it a whole lot better. The old man seemed to get more anxious and stressed the closer the day of the execution got. Sengoku wasn't exactly sure why, so he simply planned Garp to be a less involved party in the upcoming war. Sengoku was sorting through some files when Enel walked into his office, which he had been expecting, as he was informed of Enel's arrival on Marineford. "Enel, why do you never call me?" That was the very first thing that Sengoku shouted as he slapped his desk with both of his hands. In doing that, he had managed to scare his pet pigeon and goat away. Geez. Enel simply cleaned out one of his ears with his pinky, as he wondered how to speak his way out of that one. Surprisingly, Garp wasn't there to bail him out. The old man was likely off somewhere stressing himself about Ace's execution. Geez. Is that all I get? You have a few reports to hand in, Enel. Sengoku said as he angrily slammed his fist on the table. He couldn't really intimidate Enel though. Fine, calm down, your hair will get white. This comment managed to completely deflate Sengoku as he quickly took out a mirror and checked his afro for white hairs. I'll write up the reports as soon as I get to my room, Enel said as he took his usual place on the couch. At this point, Hancock also entered the room. She glared at Enel hatefully, making the rear admiral just raise an eyebrow in confusion. Fleet Admiral Sengoku. I came at your request. I assume this is related to recent news. In the end, Hancock decided to not look at Enel anymore. Sengoku's gaze turned cold at the sight of the pirate empress. The fleet admiral wasn't all that excited to meet up with the warlords after the recent mess they had been causing. Crocodile and Doflamingo enslaved kingdoms one more successfully than the other, and Jimby refused to answer to their calls, which led to him being apprehended and thrown in Impel Down. Really, the past few months hadn't been great for public perception of the warlord program. Yes, Boa Hancock. As expected, a war is soon to break out. I want all of the remaining warlords present and participating in it. Sengoku got straight to the point. He had no reason to act friendly towards a pirate. Much like Enel, he was also an older man, so he wasn't about to treat her differently due to her beauty. The fee, understood. I assume I'm at least getting a room until the war starts. Hancock didn't lose her arrogance even in front of Sengoku, which made Enel slightly impressed. Of course. I'll leave Enel to that since he was in charge of bringing you here in the first place, Sengoku said with a straight face, somewhat ignoring the pirate empress's haughty demeanor. The fleet admiral and Hancock both heard a loud groan coming from the couch, one that they both decided to ignore for now. Sengoku mentioned a few more things about the way the war was going to go, and then sent her outside the room for a bit as he wanted to have a conversation with Enel for now. Enel stared at his superior for a bit, before finally sighing and saying, I think I understand what this is about. I'm sure you do. I know you aren't stupid enough to think I wouldn't point out the elephant in the room. Sengoku slowly got up from his chair and sat down on the couch beside Enel. Conqueror's haki. Not exactly what you'd commonly find among the Marines. The only person to have developed conquerors among them is me. Why did you keep yours secret? Sengoku was one of the few people to have mastery over all three types of haki. At least that was what he had believed until recently. A Marine with Conqueror's haki was extremely uncommon as that type of haki was extremely rare in itself. Usually, people that had it were always ambitious, which led to them not becoming Marines most of the time. I'll be frank with you, Sengoku. I had no clue I had Conqueror's haki until fighting Doflamingo. Sengoku just raised an eyebrow as he pondered that for a bit. I honestly just felt him use it. Thought it wasn't that big of a deal, so I figured I should be able to use it too. Lo and behold, I was. Sengoku ended up sighing at that. I guess it does have an odd way of awakening most of the time. Fine, I believe you, for now, Sengoku said as he crossed his arms a bit. Still, that stunt you pulled could have been a lot more dangerous if Akainu and Garp didn't have your back. Well, Garp became preoccupied with other things, so only Akainu actually spoke to the five elders. Enel raised an eyebrow. He had somewhat expected Garp to be a bit out of whack, but he didn't expect the old man to forget about him like that. Makes sense. Ace is a lot more important to him than I am. Good old Akainu, huh? I'm guessing he lost some favor with the world government over that. Enel put his hand in between the couch cushions and took out one of Garp's emergency rice cracker packets. Sengoku just stared at him, before deciding to ignore that in order to spare his own sanity, and continue to talk. Not as much as we had expected apparently. The world government had already abandoned Doflamingo's family. Still, celestial dragons will always be a sore spot for them, former or not. Akainu helped you dodge a bullet there. Enel just ended up shrugging as he started eating rice crackers, loudly munching on them. Anyways, I'm glad you are back. I expect your reports regarding your mission after the war. You have 2 days to prepare for it. The Whitebeard pirates are powerful, and running away isn't an option here. Sengoku said as he started walking back to his desk. Yeah. No turning back now. See you on the field, Sengoku. Enel also got up and started walking out of the room, leaving his superior to handle his paperwork. The second he exited the room, his face fell as he remembered something. Finally done. Good, lead me to my chambers. It better have a good view. Oh, and I don't wish to be bothered until the war starts. Hancock was still there, waiting for him. Enel started at the ceiling for a bit, contemplating his life as he really hoped to actually get some calm before the upcoming storm. Chapter 59, Crossroads and Worry. Point of view narration. The days passed rather quickly for Enel. Not as quickly as he had initially hoped, as the only room he could find for Hancock happened to be near his, so this led to the Pirate Empress spending some time in Enel's room to try and annoy him, get a rise out of him, basically. This usually led to Enel kicking her out, rather forcefully, either through the window or the door. Most of the Marines nearby were rather weirded out by the fact that the most beautiful woman in the world was constantly getting kicked out of the room of a rear admiral, even if that rear admiral was actually the unranked admiral. This was all fun and games, up until Hina also returned to base and the Commodore was a bit less amused by the situation. Enel ended up assuring her that Hancock was just a general annoyance. This pleased Hina quite a bit and annoyed Hancock even further. Sengoku passed by Enel's room one day only to hear loud arguments between two women, coming from his room. To be young again. The fleet admiral didn't have the time to stop and listen to what was being said though. If he did, he'd be less proud of Enel's accomplishments. The argument was mainly Hancock calling Enel a lazy slob, Hina being unable to defend him, and ending up just calling the Pirate Empress an arrogant bitch. Eventually, Enel kicked both of them out and stopped using his room altogether, deciding he'd much rather sleep on the top of Marineford, straight on the rooftop of the main building. And that was also how he ended up running into Garp, who was also sitting on the edge of the roof, looking at Marineford with a complex gaze. Enel sighed a bit as he remembered the old man's tears from the show. Ace's execution was approaching, and he knew that it was weighing down on the old vice admiral. Enel sat down right beside the old man, looking at the large marine base with a complex gaze of his own. Enel. Garp. Their greeting was a lot less cheerful than it had usually been. The two of them were both being eaten by their own worries. Garp was worried about betraying the Marines, as they were also his family. He was also worried of betraying his grandson, betraying the promise he had made to Goldie Roger, his old friend. There was simply no good choice for him to make. Enel was in a similar situation. He was stuck. He had made a mistake and had gotten too attached to the Marines. He had befriended even the likes of Akainu. Garp and Sengoku had become people he couldn't help but care about too. Now, in a day, the time for him to carry out his plans and leave the Marines was going to come into effect. Enel knew that he couldn't continue staying in the Marines. Even if not all Marines were subservient to the world government, the Marines as an organization were still controlled by the Five Elders. He knew that if he did remain in the Marines, he'd be wasting his chance at befriending the remainder of the Whitebeard pirates, and they were going to be a large part of his fighting force in the future. He was stuck between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, he could strive to become stronger and stronger, to no longer need the support of others. But that thought was foolish. For all of his strength and speed, he knew that the world hid a lot more than was shown in the show. The world government most definitely held an ancient weapon at their disposal. The Five Elders themselves were most likely at the level of Yonko commanders themselves, otherwise they wouldn't have been called the ruling authority of the world. There was also Shanks and his mysterious motives. The Yonko that, for some reason, planned to wait for Luffy to sound the drums of liberation, before preparing to head over to Raftel. Too many complete unknowns were at play. To add yet another complication to the pile, there was also Enel's Conqueror's Hockey, which was most likely somehow related to his soul. Enel simply had too much to bargain if he tried to go at it alone. The Marines were bound to help him too, but the second he started trying to achieve his goal of uncovering the truth, the Marines would turn on him. Even if he had made friends with some of them, he knew that they would all still answer to the world's government orders to hunt him down. What would you do if you were stuck at a crossroads? Garp started speaking, the old man's voice sounded tired and weary. If on one side stood your family, people you cherished and loved, people you would give your life to, and on the other stood your duty, your responsibility to the world, and to the friends you've made across decades. Enel smiled a bit when hearing that question. Such an oddly specific conundrum you've presented me with. Garp gave Enel a hollow laugh at that jab, but it didn't last long as he let Enel continue. Sometimes, in life, there is simply no good choice. Sometimes, it feels better to not choose at all. But that isn't an option. If we stop moving, then we disappoint everyone. Enel said as he looked at his golden gauntlets with a smile. When you stop to think about it. Even if you don't do anything, life will force a choice onto you, you will go down either path regardless of your wishes. Garp looked down at his own hands, the fists that had given him the fame and reputation that he held right now. He brought his arm down on the roof, breaking off a tile and crushing it in his palm. I say. It's better to make that choice while you have the time to. Enel's words seemed to resonate with Garp, but the old man was still undecided. You're wiser than you look. I guess calling you boy might not be that accurate. I am still 37 currently, at least this body is. I may not be an old man I am, but I didn't sleep through life until now. Enel clutched at the tiles underneath him, the roof creaked a bit as both old men seemed to not care about injuring it. 37 is nothing. I guess you are still a brat after all. Garp's hollow smile turned genuine for a second, as he picked up another tile to crush in his hand. I will always be young for a fossil like you. Enel said as he crossed his legs. He was currently wearing his training clothes and no shoes, the ones that the old Enel used to wear, just with less lively colored pants. Watch your mouth, brat. Otherwise, I'll show you what these old bones can still do. Garp flexed one of his arms as he looked at Enel with renewed energy. Hee hee. Glad to see you're back. Enel said as he kept staring at Marineford's streets in the distance. Can't stay brooding all day. I'm heading to my room, gotta get some sleep before the big war. Enel had managed to somewhat cheer up Garp, but the old man was still not sure how to proceed. Still, Garp got up and prepared to leave. Garp. One last thing. The old man turned around, just as he was about to jump off. Whatever happens tomorrow, I will make sure to protect Ace and Luffy. Garp's eyes widened at that claim. What are you talking about? Enel could sense Garp clench his fists. Don't stress yourself too much. Luffy, your grandson really has a knack for making friends. He will definitely appear tomorrow. And I won't let him die. Enel's cold gaze peered into the clouds. Garp gritted his teeth, not knowing how to respond to that. I don't minus. Don't bother trying to dissuade me. I'll only interfere if it's truly needed. But I won't stand by as my friend dies. Enel's resolute words seemed to make Garp a bit conflicted. Fine. But be careful. If you do try something, you will become a target for everyone. I won't be able to help you. Who needs your help? Go to sleep, you fossil. Garp grinned a bit at that. After that, the old man didn't hang around any longer, jumping off to his room, leaving only Enel to stare at the working Marines in the distance. Many preparations were being made for the war. A lot of people are about to lose their lives. I hope all of this is worth it, Sengoku. Enel knew what he had to do. There was no need to keep brooding around either. He decided that it was time for him to get some shut-eye too. He didn't bother going back to his room though, too many visitors and too much sound for his liking. He simply used his staff as a cushion and dozed off. When I wake up, Ace will already be on that platform. Although it was only a night away, the war had already begun. Enel could feel it, the rumbling in the sky, the world itself was concerned for what was to come. But, despite that, Enel was calm. As he knew that he could take on whatever storm was approaching. Chapter 60 Execution and Whitebeard Pirates. Point of view narration. By the time Enel woke up, it was about how he had expected. The platform was up, Ace was sitting on it, and the admirals were all present, all three of them sitting in their chairs and waiting for the upcoming show. Sengoku and Garp were both on the platform. Sengoku seemed confident in himself, while Garp still seemed uncertain, speaking to Ace. Enel could feel the fear in the Marines below. But the fear was overshadowed by the pride they were feeling as Marines. They were about to go against the strongest pirate crew that currently existed. Not just a pirate crew, but Whitebeard's pirate fleet. Everyone present knew that the war they were going to be part of was going to go down in history as a large event. The execution itself was being televised all over the world, wherever possible. Everyone was bound to witness it, the execution of Goldie Rogers' last living blood relative. Enel simply stood up, went to his room and got changed into his usual attire, also putting on his coat for one last time. I really shouldn't have used this as a napkin whenever convenient. Enel stared at his coat for a bit, at least most of the stains were gone after a deep cleaning. Enel first visited the two old men standing on the platform. Sengoku was currently giving his speech, so Enel didn't interrupt him. Plenty of people noticed him just jump there, but no one said anything as he was obviously a Marine. Some considered his actions rude, but no one questioned his presence when they realized who he was. The unranked admiral had all the right to be up there. Enel stood beside Garp for a bit, looking at the gathered army of Marines below. So, have you managed to get any sleep? Enel asked as he turned his head to Garp. The old man just shrugged a bit. Barely. But I'll be fine. Garp clenched his fists. He kept his gaze forwards, seemingly afraid to glance at Ace, who was right beside the two of them. Enel didn't seem to have that same fear. The rear admiral crouched down near Ace, still looking at the crowd as he sighed a bit. Such a mess. Ace was rather surprised to hear Enel speak to him. But they had met during his short stay at Impel Down, and Enel seemed to already know about Luffy trying to break him out. I didn't choose this. Ace still didn't really consider Enel an ally. If anything, he didn't like the fact that Enel assisted Luffy, who was putting himself in danger for him. As the older brother, he felt that the situation should have been reversed. Hey, we don't often get to choose, do we? Still, in your case, this war is going to get a lot of people killed. Enel twirled one of his earlobes as he wondered about his next actions. Ace just looked down, gritting his teeth as he cursed himself inwardly. No one would blame you for this though. The Marines are starting a war this time. As for who's going to finish it, that still remains up for debate. Enel slowly got up, deciding to look for some other people to talk to. The Whitebeard pirates were going to make an appearance soon, so Enel knew that he didn't have much time left. He landed right underneath the execution platform, right behind the chairs that the admirals were sitting on. Okainu. Fancy seeing you here. From the side, he tapped Akainu on the shoulder as he leaned on the chair with a grin on his face. The admiral simply gazed at Enel for a bit. You sure took your time. Okainu said as he rubbed the bridge of his nose a bit. Can't help it. I hadn't slept in a few days. Probably won't sleep for a few more after this. Okainu merely scowled at that statement. Oh. And who is this? A lazy voice could be heard from the side. It belonged to none other than Borsalino, or Kizaru. The tall and lanky, yellow costume-wearing admiral. Enel smirked a bit as he remembered a bit more about each admiral. I think it's pretty obvious. Rear Admiral Enel, right? I heard a lot about you. Okiji, the white costume-wearing Ice Admiral, seemed to already know who Enel was. I guess we haven't been formally introduced though. A pleasure to meet you too, Admiral Kizaru and Admiral Okiji. Okiji just nodded, while Kizaru let off another bored yawn. The hell? Why are you never this polite with me? Okainu was quick to turn his head to Enel though, taking the matter rather seriously. Hey, nothing bad with trying to make a good first impression. Enel simply cleaned out his ear as he tapped Akainu on the shoulder with his earlobe. Anyway, I'm off, see you three on the flip side. With that, Enel simply used Soru and appeared in between the other Marines below. He spotted Hina in the crowd rather easily with his observation haki. So he walked all the way to her and wrapped one of his earlobes around her arm. Hina was startled at first, but she smiled when seeing that it was just Enel. Enel. You scared Hina. She said as she pouted a bit, still, her smile was hard to hide. That was the whole point. Anyway, didn't come here for that. Enel said as he gave her a lazy smile of his own. Hina raised an eyebrow. She hoped Enel would help lessen the tense atmosphere she found herself in, but the usually cheerful Rear Admiral was currently being rather serious with her. Whatever happens next. I want you to take care of yourself, okay? No stupid hero stuff, the world has enough of those types to go around. Enel tilted his head a bit, not breaking his gaze from Hina's for 1 second, just to make sure she got the message. In the end, Hina just nodded. Don't worry, Hina can take care of herself. Hina should be telling you that. You always jump from problem to problem. Hina crossed her arms as she didn't bother to hide the concern in her tone. Hee, don't worry about it. Enel simply walked away after that, leaving Hina to her own thoughts. He landed back near the platform, right beside Garp and Suru, just as Sengoku had finished half of his speech. Portas Dias. The death of. This pirate holds great significance. Enel also looked at the stadium when hearing those words. He tried to remember where the speech was going, but the details of that scene were rather muddled. After all, he hadn't paid perfect attention to all aspects of the show. Ace. Tell me the name of your father. Sengoku said as he held his small transponder snail. Enel raised an eyebrow as he finally remembered where Sengoku was going with this. Enel could hear Ace as he claimed that his only father was Whitebeard. That was when Sengoku called him a liar and proceeded to tell everyone the story of his birth. Of how Porgas de Rouge had kept her pregnancy going for 20 months through sheer will, all in order to deceive the world. Enel simply scowled as he liked what he was hearing less and less. A child was born, carrying the blood of the vilest man in the world. That child was you. Your father is the Pirate King, Gold Roger. The entire navy was silent at that proclamation. No, the entire world was silent. The information was known to only a few important figures in the world. Sengoku had just pulled it out and revealed it to the entire world. Enel simply stared at the platform. He wasn't silent due to shock. He simply held the entire situation in disdain. Executing a child. For the sins of the father? So strange. Enel said as he spoke to nobody in particular. But Garp besides him could hear him clearly. A newborn child bears no sin. Garp. Take care of my child. Fragments of that memory rang in the old vice admiral's mind. He could only clench his fist as he looked at the figure of Ace on the platform. Maybe if he hadn't become a pirate. Maybe I could have convinced Sengoku. But now. The old man thought to himself after remembering the words of his old friend, Goldie Roger. Enel sighed as he turned off the rest of the speech in his mind. He paid attention only to what was in front of him. He didn't need to act right away after all. And, after a while, the pirates started appearing. Enel counted hundreds of ships in the distance, all wearing different Jolly Rogers. All of them were part of Whitebeard's grand fleet. Enel smiled as he saw a shadow in the bay, right in the middle of the docks, in the heart of Marineford. The sea started roaring, and 3 large, well-shaped ships burst out of the water, followed by an entire fleet of pirate ships in the distance. The Moby Dick. They coated their ships and approached underwater. I can't believe this. Sengoku said as he narrowed his eyes a bit, some sweat rising on his brow. The Moby Dick was the main ship, the only one that had the figurehead of a white whale. And a tall man walked out brazenly on it, no trace of fear at all, as he stared down the entire combined might of the navy. His scalp was hidden by a black bandana, his scarred body was clothed in a white captain's coat, and a pair of loose pants tucked inside his large black boots. Enel could also see his signature mustache, forming a half-circle going upwards from right underneath his nose. The man held onto his signature weapon, the Murakamoguri. A massive naginata, one that fit the size of the gargantuan man that wielded it. Enel smiled a bit as he finally caught sight of a pirate that held one of the highest bounties in the world. A man worth 5 billion berry. Father. Enel could hear Ace mutter as he stared at the giant pirate. You better tell me that my son is all right. It's been a while, Sengoku. Whitebeard's words resonated across the battlefield. Enel could see many of the Marines get discouraged just by seeing him. But Whitebeard wasn't alone. All 14 of his commanders were present, including Marco, the only one that Enel had seen in the past. Father. Ace shouted in that instant, making the old pirate smile in the distance. Whitebeard then did the move that had jump-started the war. He brought his fist to his stomach, crossing his arms in the process, and then he stretched his fists on both sides of his body, punching the air with force. The Marines seemed to fear this motion as the air around Whitebeard started cracking, space itself became distorted, and tremors were sent across the seas. Water levels rose in that instant, creating larger and larger waves in the distance. Enel could see them. The approaching tsunamis threatened to swallow Marineford. So this is it, huh? The strongest man in the world. Enel's smile turned whiter as his excitement grew. I can befriend the Whitebeard pirates. But I want to clash with him at least once. Enel gave Garp and Tsuru a look. I'll leave you too. From this point on it's good luck. The rear admiral shouted as he jumped in and joined the crowd of Marines below. Garp just sighed, his gaze turning grave. The tears in his eyes hadn't even dried up properly yet, now he had to fight. To fight in order for his grandson to die. Still, a part of him still held hope, a part of him tried to tell him that everything would work out in the end. Maybe Enel will really manage to save him. Chapter 61, Clashing with the Strongest. Point of view narration. From the start, Enel knew that he couldn't just jump ship and start fighting Marines. Especially not after befriending so many of them. Instead, he decided to do what he did best, take on Whitebeard with all of his strength. The old man had gone to war prepared to die, his sickness was catching up to him regardless, so he likely wanted to make sure that he at least saved his children. In truth, his death was one of the most tragic in Enel's opinion. The old man had come to this place with the sole purpose of saving his son, Porgas Diaz. And not only had that part failed, but many of his children had also lost their lives in the process. And, to add even more insult to injury, Whitebeard had actually lost his life to the traitor that had started the war in the first place. Blackbeard, the one that had captured Ace and turned him into the Marines in order to gain a warlord rank. Blackbeard had not only killed him, but he had also stolen his power, which he then proceeded to use on his other children. Thankfully, Enel's plans changed that future in its entirety. But first, Enel needed things to proceed as normal, at least to some extent. Enel could see Okiji get prepared to freeze over the tsunamis, which also meant that Luffy was on his way. Enel didn't want to waste time until then though. He appeared on one of the cannons of Marineford, looking directly at Whitebeard with a smile on his face. The old pirate was quick to notice him, raising an eyebrow for a second, as Enel's staff turned into a large naginata. Enel jumped, creating a sonic boom, pushing all of the Marines around him backwards. In midair, the blade of his naginata turned black as a wide smile reached Enel's lips. Newgate. Enel shouted as he prepared to swing his naginata in an obvious motion. Whitebeard smiled at that scene. Young people get more and more impressive each generation. Marco, as well as a few of the captains, wanted to quickly intercept the brazen rear admiral that was trying to attack their father. But all of them stopped when Whitebeard showed them the back of his palm, signaling them to stand down. Whitebeard then stepped heavily on his ship, making it shake in the water as his blade also seemed to turn black, with red lightning crackling around it. He quickly turned around slightly and swung his naginata upwards, meeting Enel's blade halfway. What followed was a clash that managed to shock the world. Their blades didn't get to touch as their wills clashed first. The world around them slowed to a crawl, and the birds in the sky seemed to flee in fear. The skies were ripped wide open as the waves around Marineford stopped in their tracks. The air broke at Whitebeard's blade as the veins on the old man's arms became more and more apparent. The shockwave pushed every Marine back. The rest of the Whitebeard pirates on board were also forced to plunge their weapons into the ship in order to hold on. Pops. Marco plugged one of his talons into the ship, as his wings protected most of the crew members behind him. He hadn't expected Enel, a rear admiral of all people, to be the first on the Marine side to attack. Reckless idiot. Hina and Akainu shouted in the distance, surprisingly at the exact same time. The two fighters that were clashing had completely closed off their perception of the world around them, though their wills focused entirely on one another. Whitebeard didn't seem to be mad about the attack. Instead, all of the people could hear a burst of loud laughter. Grrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr each other, each trying to push the other a bit more with each second that passed. Enel could feel it, his golden gauntlets bursting and being sent flying like shrapnel towards different buildings in the distance. He could feel his muscles bursting from the strain as his hacky struggled to try to keep up with Whitebeard's strength. In the end, the strongest man alive obviously prevailed, his large arms flexing with his muscles straining a bit. Enel was blasted backwards, he ended up being plunged like a nail into one of Marineford's buildings in the distance, breaking it completely in the process as a dust cloud obscured everyone's view of Enel's state. But the clash itself had lasted for around a dozen seconds. Something that far exceeded everyone's expectations. Enel! Akainu shouted as he stood up. Many turned to the Admiral to see him madly looking in between both the dust cloud and Whitebeard in the distance. Sengoku also released a frustrated sigh. He just had to go and do something like that. Okiji, the Ice Admiral, was rather shocked at what he had just witnessed, but he didn't let that shock last for long as he proceeded to quickly freeze the tsunami surrounding Marineford. Kizaru simply muttered impressive as he patted some of the dust that had reached his costume. The clash had been large enough to affect everyone on Marineford. And so, the war started, with Okiji also quickly freezing all of the water in the bay and the pirates being energized by witnessing their father/captain's strength. Enel simply looked at the holes in the collapsed ceiling above him. Yeah. That went a lot better than I expected. Enel didn't get up, laying in that rubble pile for a bit more as he wondered why someone like Whitebeard would even need to struggle in that clash. I guess his sickness really has gotten to him. Still, Enel looked at his arms, both of them had burst muscles and ruptured skin. It was clear that the old man wasn't holding back to make things easier for Enel. If he was in his prime, he would have most likely turned my arms into a thin paste. Enel winced at the thought. Enel then glanced at the side, glancing at the bent naginata that had landed a bit further away from him. Enel didn't let that complete loss discourage him though. The tiredness he felt was also not something he concerned himself with. The main thing that he felt right now was excitement. I didn't instantly die when clashing with the strongest man in the world. All of the sleepless weeks he had spent training, all of the blood and sweat he had shed to grow his strength in such a short time. All of that was validated by that single clash. Sparring with Garp was not the same as this. The old man had always gone somewhat easy on Enel. After all, in a life and death battle, Garp could likely kill Enel in a few punches. Enel knew that facing these top powers with only his body and enhanced speed was simply impossible. But now he had forged his body and hockey enough to at least take a serious hit from someone of Garp's and Whitebeard's caliber. So, Enel could only laugh. Much like he had laughed during the clash with Whitebeard. That satisfying feeling of seeing and feeling the results of his training. It was more than cathartic, it was almost addictive. Enel stood in that rubble for a bit longer. Then he slowly got up, walking over to his bent naginata, picking it up and straightening it with his power as he turned it back into a staff. He put the staff on his back as his arms could use a break currently. Enel then proceeded to use his observation hockey and went to collect the gold from his gauntlets, reforming them and using them to tightly bind his wounded arms. The tight fit seemed to somewhat quell the bleeding. As Enel was finally prepared to step back into the war. To Enel's surprise, Squard's betrayal hadn't happened anymore as Enel's clash with Whitebeard had made all of the captains vigilant and Marco was able to stop him before he stabbed his father in the back. Whitebeard still hugged Squard, despite the attempted betrayal. The old man could forgive people stabbing him in the back, that was just how much lenience he gave to his children. It was rather admirable, but Enel didn't have the time to ponder on that for too long. The war had already jump-started, and Luffy was already being assisted by his companions as he ran towards Ace's platform. Akainu was currently facing Whitebeard, Marco was fighting with Kizaru, holding him back, and Okiji was also fighting a few of the captains by himself. Hancock was doing a lot more damage to the Marines than she was to the pirates, something that didn't quite shock Enel. Hina was doing her best, but she wasn't strong enough to make a large difference in a war of that scale. Enel started walking towards the platform. He looked at Garp, who was currently sitting near Ace. He jeppoed his way on top of the platform, shocking Sengoku a bit with his messy appearance. Enel, why did you do that? Sengoku shouted in annoyance. He had hoped for his plans of turning Nougat's children against him would work to weaken the old man even further. But Enel's outburst had made things a lot worse for him. Why wouldn't I? This is a war, Sengoku. You can't micromanage every aspect of it. Enel said as he sat down on the platform, glancing at the situation with a weary gaze. Akainu was having a difficult time matching up with a less injured Whitebeard. But he was still holding his own. We will talk more after this. Don't get involved without my orders anymore. Enel just rolled his eyes at that. He was getting the same treatment as Garp for some reason. Enel could see the pacifists being destroyed by Hancock as she shielded Luffy from them. It was also at this point that Sengoku gave the executioners the word, and they raised their blades to pierce Ace. Luffy rushed through the crowd of trained Marines. Enel whistled as he tried to understand how Luffy was even holding his own against that many Marines. But that didn't last forever, as he was pushed to the ground eventually. The people helping him were all preoccupied with fighting strong opponents after all. That was when it happened. Just as Ace was about to die, Luffy released a burst of Conqueror's haki powerful enough to knock out all of the Marines near him and the executioners on stage. Enel could feel that burst of energy. He could tell it was untrained, but he could also tell that it was strong. A lot stronger than he had expected it to be. He could see all of the admirals being shocked by it. Even Akainu turned his head around slightly, which made him receive a punch that sent him flying into the distance. Kizaru was quick to try and shoot a laser towards Luffy, which was blocked by Ivankov as he positioned himself in front of it and released a hell wink. Enel struggled to understand just what that attack was while Luffy continued making his way to the platform, as one of his allies and a revolutionary fighter created a bridge of stone for him. Enel couldn't help but wonder how the world aligned for Joy Boy to get his way. The way things were positioning themselves, it made Enel wonder how exactly Akainu had even managed to kill Ace. Chapter 62, Saving a Pirate. Point of view narration. Enel didn't bother to stop Luffy at all, he simply yawned as he sat down on the edge of the execution platform. If Luffy had failed his Conqueror's haki reveal event, Enel would have interfered without a second thought. He was waiting for the last second. If the blades touched Ace's skin, then Enel would have pushed the executioners away without hesitation. But it wasn't needed apparently. Garp also did his thing and let Luffy knock him out as the young man rushed to save his brother. Luffy also noticed Enel, but he didn't try to attack the rear admiral, only shouting hello, long ears. As he ran past him, Enel simply smiled a bit as he let out another yawn. Ace. I'm here to save you. Luffy quickly took out the key that Hancock had given him. That was when Enel noticed something strange. Kizaru, unlike he was supposed to do in the show, aimed his laser, not at the key, but directly at Luffy's head. Using future sight, Enel was able to just barely move the tip of his blackened staff in front of that yellow laser, parting it in many sides as it broke some of the buildings in the distance. Enel masked that as him simply stretching, but plenty of people had managed to catch that movement, including Whitebeard from below. The old pirate just smirked at that Luffy brat really has a talent for making friends. Enel? What is the meaning of this? Sengoku shouted as he quickly started growing larger, finally turning into a golden giant as Enel just stared with a wry smile. What do you mean, boss? I'm just stretching here, did something happen? Enel simply said as he looked up at the fleet admiral without any shame in his gaze. Luffy had completely missed what had happened, but Ace was able to see it rather clearly. So he's on our side. No, I guess he's just Luffy's friend, otherwise, he wouldn't have attacked Pops. Ace thought to himself as Luffy was quick to try and turn the key to his sea stone cuffs. Do you really think I'd just let you do that? Sengoku said to the side as he completely turned into a giant golden human. Enel narrowed his eyes a bit as he jumped a bit off the platform. Sengoku's palm released a shockwave, one that Luffy was miraculously able to block with a balloon. Well, he didn't really block it. He just resisted it for long enough for their footing to completely collapse. Enel hopped in the air on one leg as he looked at the situation with crossed arms. Kizaru hadn't attempted any other similar attack on Luffy, but Enel could tell that the admiral was rather displeased with Enel's involvement. Enel blinked a few times as a flying blue bird rushed towards him. It was none other than Marco. Enel simply scowled, both of his legs hopped on the air as he blasted himself forwards and met the flying phoenix head-on. Staff met claws as flames started spreading out around them. Thank you, Enel Yoi. Marco whispered a bit as he then pushed Enel back a bit using his talents, and proceeded to fly away and save a few of his crewmates from Kizaru. Enel just let him off as he realized that Marco most likely thought Enel was still trying to remain as a marine. What an oddball. The rear admiral thought to himself as he looked back at Ace and Luffy. At this point, Ace had already been freed. He and Luffy were throwing around marines as they were quickly retreating. Enel raised an eyebrow as he finally noticed the odd looks Kizaru was giving him. Eventually, he started hopping toward the two retreating pirate brothers. Whitebeard also gave the following order next. Everyone. Protect Ace and Luffy. We are retreating. The old man hadn't received anywhere near as many injuries as he had in the original. Akainu hadn't been able to take him by surprise much without the squad's betrayal, which would have severely injured Whitebeard. The situation was really stacked against the magma-spitting admiral. Kizaru had tried aiding him as much as possible, but Marco had him covered on that front. Okiji was also assisting, but he wasn't a great team fighter for Akainu, as the other admiral's magma was constantly getting in the way of his ice. And his ice was also being crushed by Whitebeard's tremors. Whitebeard had still received quite a few injuries, including a magma-fueled punch to the chest. But it had been a trade-off, as Akainu was squashed into the ground in order to land that one. Okiji was quick to try and stop Ace and Luffy, but Ace's fire seemed to overwhelm his ice, which meant he was unable to do much to stop their retreat. So, he quickly switched roles with Akainu, Okiji quickly taking to fighting Whitebeard, as Akainu chased after the last remaining blood relative of Goldie Roger. The two of them clashed, which led to Ace being quickly overwhelmed. My magma can easily burn your fire. Enel could hear Akainu gloat a bit as he managed to slightly injure and push back the fire-creating pirate. Enel could hear all of the captains in Whitebeard's crew shouting in desperation for Ace to run. Marco had been trapped with sea stone cuffs, so he was unable to rush there and stop Akainu. And, unfortunately, the young and courageous Ace was being riled on by Akainu's insults. It wouldn't have mattered much if Akainu had just insulted Ace, but he had also insulted Whitebeard. Ace ignored his crewmates, he also ignored his father's words to retreat. He respected him far too much to allow him to be insulted by anyone. But how exactly was Ace supposed to be able to win against Akainu? He was once again pushed back. This time Luffy also got involved, trying to punch the admiral and make him back off a bit. At that point, Luffy also got slightly burnt, which sent him tumbling towards the ground in pain as he clutched at his burnt arm. Enel raised an eyebrow at that as he wondered why Luffy's fire immunity wasn't coming into play. Okainu then towered over him, his fist cocked backwards, trying to kill the young fledgling pirate. That was when Ace got in front of him. Enel could basically hear the scared shouts of Ace's crewmates. Ace was determined. He wasn't about to let his young brother die right in front of him, not while he could still do something to stop it. Even if that something meant giving his life away. Just as Okainu's fist was about to pierce Ace, Ace gritted his teeth as he looked at Luffy in front of him. That was also when Enel appeared right in between Ace and Luffy, his staff instantly tuning into a blackened half-sphere that covered Ace. The young pirate was shocked as Enel had technically just teleported in his face, but he didn't have the time to react much verbally as he was quickly pulled by a metallic tendril and thrown back into Luffy, sending the two of them tumbling a bit. Enel's sphere was quickly melted through as he pulled back his metals and reformed them in his gauntleted arms, recreating his staff in an instant. Enel, what stunt are you trying to pull? Okainu was beyond pissed off when he realized what had happened. He had been a millimeter away from killing Ace from completing his mission before Enel had interfered. Okainu, I don't mean this in a bad way, but I hardly see any reason why either of these kids should die by your hand today. Enel's words weren't anywhere near as loud. Still, all of the people that heard them could only recoil in shock. Some had already seen Enel protect Luffy, but that could have been interpreted as a mistake. No one knew that Kizaru was aiming for Luffy's head anyway. So it wasn't anywhere near as major as him jumping in front of Akainu. This time though, he had well and truly done it. Enel, are you betraying the Marines? In order to save two dirty criminals. Okainu's anger could clearly be felt as his fist lunged forwards. His punch crashed into the ground with the force of a volcanic eruption. Enel had managed to jump away without much issue, but he could see the ground being split open and magma started to rise. Dirty criminals. I agree that most pirates deserve that moniker, but these two haven't done much to earn it. I'm sick and tired of this. Okainu raised an eyebrow at Enel's words. They gained their bounties rightfully. They slighted the world government time and time again. Okainu didn't want to give up on his fellow Marines so easily, but Enel wasn't budging. Heh. We both know that bounties have nothing to do with crimes, Okainu. It's all about what the government feels. Okainu's anger manifested again in Ugami Guren. With his fist cocked back, he shot a wave of magma shaped like a fanged dot towards Enel, who had just landed on the ground. Enel simply pointed his arm towards the incoming attack. El Thor. His hand instantly turned into a huge laser that completely dwarfed the incoming attack. Okainu simply saw a flash of light, after which he was sent flying by the lightning blast as the ground around him was burnt to a crisp. The laser continued forwards, passing above the heads of many Marines and hitting the Marine headquarters, creating an explosion that sent tremors throughout the island. So cool. Luffy said to the side, which made Enel just stare at him for a bit. That display managed to somewhat halt the aggression, as everyone was currently staring at the unfolding disaster in front of them. L lightning. One of the Marines said as he took a step back. Many of the Marines had similar reactions. Many didn't know whether this was a good thing or not, but since Enel had just blasted Akainu further inland, most surmised that this wasn't a good thing at all. Enel. Sengoku was the first to shout as he dashed towards the traitorous Marine. His palm extended towards him, releasing a large shockwave that pushed back most of the Marines nearby. Enel simply turned into a bolt of lightning and traveled up Sengoku's arm, paralyzing it in the process. Rather stormy today, wouldn't you say so? Enel said as he crouched down on Sengoku's shoulder and looked at the clouds in wonder. Why are you doing this? Sengoku said as he tried to calm down a bit. He still didn't want to consider Enel as an enemy. I can't let you kill my friend, referring to Luffy, by the way. If we were executing some big shot pirate, then I wouldn't care, but this is just a bunch of kids. Enel said as he jumped a few times and headed for the clouds. That was when another admiral decided to intervene. Yasakanai no Magatama. Kama Jewel of 8 Shaku, countless rays of light headed for Enel as Kizaru finally decided to get involved in that mess. As a bolt of lightning, Enel managed to dance around the light rays as he also started receiving more and more attacks. Ice block, partisan. Enel's body then twirled to the side as dozens of ice spears were sent toward him. Kuzan also decided to try and contribute to the fight. At this point, the Whitebeard pirates were starting to retreat, so no one was holding back the admirals anymore. Enel simply swung his staff, creating a dome around him as all of the spears were blocked. Enel frowned a bit as he felt his shield freeze over, but that didn't last long as he sent a current of electricity through it, heating it up and melting all of the accumulated ice. Ryusei Kazan. Meteor Volcano. Akainu had also managed to fly back from the other side of the island. His fists were pointed at the sky as he shot countless giant magma fists toward Enel. At this point, most of the lower-ranking Marines were running away, same for the weaker pirates. Enel didn't falter at all in the face of the attacking admirals though. Songo. Lightning Flash. Enel raised an arm to the skies, out of it parted countless lightning bolts, striking down on Marineford and intercepting all of the attacks that were coming his way. Countless explosions spread and left behind only scorched earth. Enel did his best to avoid hitting the Marines below, but it was difficult with all of the admirals attacking him. Enel was currently using the techniques that the old Enel had already trained. He wanted to see just how well they held up. Thankfully, they seemed to be rather effective as most of the strikes that had been heading towards him were shot down. Pandemonium spread as more and more people realized that they were being attacked by yet another fruit that was capable of destroying islands. As if Whitebeard wasn't enough. One of the Marines below said as he ran as far as he could. Fear and confusion were the most common thing among the Marine ranks now. Their morale was extremely low, and the only thing keeping the fight going was their pride. After that clash, the situation had calmed down a bit as Enel floated in the skies and looked down at Marineford with narrowed eyes. Akainu was still recovering, as Enel's lightning had injured him a bit. Sengoku had been struck by a few stray bolts of lightning, but he was just paralyzed for a bit, not seriously injured by any stretch of the imagination. Kizaru and Kuzan were forced to break their attention as some of the captains of Whitebeard's crew started attacking them in order to try and cover their crewmates' retreat. It was now that the situation took a strange turn. It seems we are a bit late to the party. A boisterous voice was heard from the side. Chapter 63, Marshal D. Teach in Adversity. Point of view narration. What the hell is this guy doing here? Enel pondered as he looked at the massive figure that had just pulled up to the scene. Enel could clearly see Blackbeard and his gathered crew waltz into the ongoing war. Even their giant had shown himself, as he had been hiding behind some tall buildings. The former rear admiral was utterly flabbergasted that the idiot had actually shown up at Marineford. In the original, he showed up only when Whitebeard was missing half of his head. Why is he here now? Enel thought he'd have to hunt down Blackbeard after the war, as that would have made the most sense with how things had been developing. Shuriyo was also there. The psychopath looked a bit less calm than usual though, as his gaze met Enel's. Old man. Teach spoke out with an arrogant grin on his face. The Marines were all shocked when seeing so many criminals gathered around Blackbeard. He had truly gathered an all-star crew of criminals so feared that their names had been erased from history. Shuriya. What is the meaning of this? What happened to Magellan? Why are all of you here? Sengoku slowly got up in the distance. The anger in his voice was rather obvious. You'll find out what happened to him soon. Anyway, I've decided to team up with these guys. Shuriya said as he smoked his cigar and looked around the battlefield. His hand was already on his blade as he prepared for the worst. Sengoku kept questioning them about how they had passed through the gates of justice and whatnot, but Enel was no longer paying attention to that. He didn't care all that much for Blackbeard's crew currently. But that wasn't the case for Whitebeard, as he was the first one to walk up towards his former son. Teach. The older man said as he looked down at his disowned son. Blackbeard was speaking haughtily about the way he had overcome the gates of justice, about how magnificent his plan was. At least until he ate a shockwave from Whitebeard's naginata. All of his crew members who were nearby were sent flying into rubble, but all of them got up rather quickly. Marco was quick to turn into a blue phoenix and was about to rush and assist his father. Marco. Stand back. Whitebeard stopped him instantly though. Whitebeard then continued to make his way toward the newcomers. You broke the one iron rule on my ship. Let's settle this, Teach. Akainu also started flying towards Whitebeard. While he's distracted, we must at least kill Whitebeard. Akainu was still injured due to receiving attacks from both Enel and Whitebeard, but he didn't let that hinder him much. He dashed forwards, heading straight for the legendary pirate with malicious intent. Enel wasn't about to let him interfere with the father-son reunion though. He was genuinely curious as to how Blackbeard planned to defeat Whitebeard under these circumstances. The lightning man was quick to dash towards Akainu's back, What he hadn't expected was to be intercepted right when he got near the admiral. "You brat." It was none other than the old Garp. His blackened fist cocked backwards and struck at Enel's face. The old man had likely anticipated that he'd go after Akainu, so he had enough time to act. Although Garp sounded mad, he had a large smile on his face. It was clear that this was nothing more than keeping up appearances to him. In truth, the old man was currently feeling like crying tears of happiness. Both of his grandsons had survived. Who cared if they were pirates? To him, they were family. And Enel had made a sacrifice and protected that family when he was too conflicted to do so himself. Although he acted mad, deep inside, he felt that he owed Enel quite a lot on this occasion. Enel also knew that Garp was likely not mad at him. So he decided to not try and injure Garp in any way. With skillful movements and using his observation haki to bend himself around Garp's body, paralyzing him in the process and still going straight for Akainu. Garp fell to the ground, unable to use Jeppo as his body refused to listen to him for half a second. The old man smiled as Akainu's claw was intercepted by Enel's staff. Akainu swore loudly as sparks arose from their armament haki-enhanced strikes. His claw seemed to be winning though, as it was starting to cut into the staff. This wasn't just a contest of strength though, it was a battle. So Enel was quick to bind the staff around the admiral's arm. Akainu struggled, as he was then hurled towards the ground, his body weakened by the sea stone-laced staff that Enel wielded. Enel didn't stop there though, he managed to bind Akainu in thick chains, and then he sent the admiral flying with a strike of his staff. Sengoku acted quickly, catching Akainu and sending a volley of shockwaves toward Enel and Whitebeard. Enel simply winced as his staff quickly turned into dozens of tendrils aiming to intercept each shockwave before they reached him. The air blasted the tendrils apart, but the shockwaves were successfully stopped. At this point Enel was pushed a bit more, and he was standing back to back with Whitebeard. The old man huffed a bit, observing the rear admiral from the corner of his eye. Doing such useless things. Still, thank you for saving my son. Newgate gave Enel his gratitude in a short exchange, as he turned his attention back to Teach. Don't mention it. Now, if we could both get the hell out of here after you deal with this bastard. Enel said as he continued to block whatever incoming attacks he could with bolts of lightning. Teach had also dashed towards Whitebeard at this point. He already had spread out his darkness underneath the two of them. It wasn't doing all that much besides preventing the old man from moving. Unfortunately for Teach, Whitebeard had no intention of moving his legs. The large man instead swung his naginata, a white halo covering the blade of it as he intercepted Blackbeard's fist. Zahahaha. Teach laughed loudly as his fist seemed to hinder the quake powers that Whitebeard wielded. But that didn't do all that much in the end, as Whitebeard's naginata still cut through his arm. The old man's haki being a few leagues above that of Teach. That slash sent Blackbeard tumbling towards the ground as he screamed in pain and held his bleeding arm. Whitebeard simply huffed, a white halo covered his fist as he seemed to crush Teach underneath it. The air started cracking rapidly, and Teach was being squashed into the ground. Blood spilled out of his mouth as the bones in his body broke rapidly. The cracks spread all over the ground, and the shockwave that wave produced shook Marineford and pushed back most of Blackbeard's crew members. What? Are you trying to kill me? Teach shouted as he struggled underneath Whitebeard's fist. Edward Newgate simply huffed at that shameful display. Retrieving his fist and staring down at the pathetic form of his former son. Enel also raised an eyebrow at that display. This buffoon was supposed to be the main antagonist of the show? Enel thought to himself as his palm parted into lightning bolts and blocked off a few light rays and even more shockwaves. This can't keep going forever. Enel thought to himself as he wondered if grabbing Whitebeard and escaping was an option. At this point, most of the important figures in the Marines were heading his way, trying to both take him down and kill Whitebeard. Ace and Luffy had already managed to jump onto a submarine, and Jimby had helped them navigate through the water and break the ice in order for them to retreat successfully. At this point, the Marines had zero chance of actually killing Ace or Luffy. But Whitebeard hadn't left Marineford yet. He planned to be the last to leave, to make sure not one of his children was left behind. He was covering their retreat by catching the attention of the Marines. And Enel was doing the expert job of blocking every single attack that was heading for his back as he dealt with his former son that had just appeared on the battlefield. Enel knew that he would slowly start getting tired if the situation continued like that. Both of his injured hands were pointed forwards, lightning raining everywhere in front of him, blocking and pushing back all of the Marines nearby. Shit. Why do we have to deal with both Rumble and Quake in the same war? A few Marines couldn't help but express their grievances. One invincible fruit was more than difficult enough to fight, now they had two island-destroying beasts to deal with at the same time. Still, Enel didn't aim directly for them. Enel wanted to avoid bloodshed as much as possible. But the lightning bolts sent currents through the ground, paralyzing more and more Marines. Whitebeard's tremors also created great cracks, as the whole of Marineford trembled under the attacks of the two devil fruit users. Blackbeard was quick to call for the help of his newly assembled crew, and all of them started trying to attack Whitebeard. Whitebeard winced as his body stopped momentarily due to his sickness. Blackbeard's crew quickly took that opportunity, many of them pointing their guns at the strongest man in the world with nasty smiles on their faces. Blackbeard also took out a gun hurriedly, and in sync with all of his subordinates, they all started shooting at the old man. Marco shouted in the distance as he quickly turned into a phoenix and rushed towards his father, disregarding the previous orders. The other captain followed after him. But Whitebeard wasn't alone in this. Metal tendrils extended from behind him, perfectly blocking all of the incoming bullets. Gather your wits, old man. I'll take care of the small fry, you punish your son. Enel jumped up and tapped Whitebeard on the shoulder as he turned towards the Blackbeard pirates. Whitebeard pirates. Hold back the Marines for a few seconds. Enel's order reverberated throughout the battlefield. This kicked into gear the rest of the captains as they all quickly started trying to fight against the Marines in a desperate rush to save their father. The old man was going to complain about the insubordination, but he refrained when seeing the mad look in Enel's eyes. I get that you want to protect your kids. But this isn't the time for that. This is a winning battle, retreat only after everything is won. Whitebeard simply smiled at Enel's words. Fine. But I don't like you ordering my children around. Whitebeard said as he stared at Teach with a cold look. Enel also started twirling his staff, metal tendrils from his gauntlets still blocking all of the bullets coming toward the two of them. Enel looked at the bastards that made up Blackbeard's crew. Now, to deal with this trash. Chapter 64, Cleaning Up and Retreat. Point of view narration. Garp didn't really know what to expect when Enel had said that he'd make sure Ace and Luffy survived. He sure as hell didn't expect Enel to start throwing lighting around like it was candy on Halloween. Garp had pretended to attack him in rage, but he didn't really care what happened in the war anymore. To him, the only thing that mattered was the fact that both his grandsons survived. Now, the fact that Enel was obviously protecting Whitebeard did strike him as odd, but he knew that Whitebeard was a respectable man, so he didn't let it get to his head. In his books, Enel was a great friend. One that made a sacrifice to protect his friends, which also happened to be Garp's grandsons. This was not the same for Sengoku, unfortunately. The old fleet admiral was shocked from the moment Enel had blocked one of Kizaru's lasers in order to protect Luffy. He had hoped that event was just a fluke, but Enel then stopped Akainu and revealed the true nature of his devil fruit. That truly angered the old man, not as much as it confused him though. So, you're telling me that everything was fake? All of that was a lie? If Enel had just revealed his fruit in the war while fighting for the Marines, Sengoku wouldn't have minded. He could somewhat understand Enel trying to hide it. The world government was always interested in powerful fruits, so they would have certainly tried to do something shady earlier than Dressrosa. But the fact that Enel had seemingly turned against them. It simply stung for the old fleet admiral. He had been somewhat cautious since the beginning with Enel, but he had still befriended him in the end. And Hina wasn't any better. She was mad, she felt like she had been deceived. But a part of her refused to believe that Enel had lied to her. A part of her kept saying that maybe Enel had a good reason for his actions, that maybe his friendship with her wasn't fake. Anything, to justify his actions. But Enel didn't reveal his true motives to anyone, so she had no way of knowing. Hina had decided to stand back during the war. The last thing she wanted was to actually fight Enel. She also didn't even feel prepared to face him right away. Hina could also see that the warlords were no longer getting involved, they were merely watching the situation unfold with interest. Enel, I hope that you know what you're doing. I hope it was worth it. Hina thought to herself as she took a few steps back and observed the situation with the lower-ranking Marines. The commanders of the Whitebeard crew had no time to think about those things though. They all quickly started to hold back the Marines that were attacking their father's back. Enel knew to take advantage of that. Blackbeard's crew seemed to realize that Enel's attention was now fully on them. Enel looked first at the giant that had been hiding behind Marineford's base. His eyes sparked with lightning as he tapped his staff onto the ground. Mamaragan. Heavy thunder. The clouds that he had overcharged with lightning roared with anger. A rain of lightning fell onto the giant. His size only made him a larger target. Each bolt left more and more burns on the giant's body, all until the giant was well and thoroughly cooked, collapsing from severe injuries. The ground shook as lightning kept falling everywhere, taking also impeding many marines and assisting the Whitebeard pirates further in their retreat. The giant's unconscious body hit the ground with a loud thud, breaking a few more walls in the process. Enel had avoided the giant's head, mainly in order to avoid killing him completely. He still wanted the remainders of Blackbeard's pirates to be captured after all, just in case he needed them in the future. The other pirates in the group seemed to be a bit shocked, seeing their largest and most resilient member fall in a few seconds of the fight starting. Enel then dashed towards the group, not giving them much time to register what had just happened. They all seemed to take a step back when seeing him rush like that. The next to fall was Jesus Burgess, his face caved in by Enel's heavy staff before he could even react properly. Enel then provided to turn his staff and strike towards one of the nearest pirates. Doc Q only had enough time to shriek as he was sent flying into the crowd of marines in the distance. Katarina Devon was the next target, but she had enough time to prepare herself, managing to block Enel's staff with her spear. She wasn't known as the most dangerous woman pirate in Impel Down for nothing. Her blackened spear seemed to be able to hold up against Enel's staff perfectly. But Enel wasn't about to start playing around with her like he had Jack the Drought. With a small twirl, his staff parted around her weapons and pierced her body in 10 different places. Or at least they tried to. She had managed to cover herself in armament in time, which led to sparks rising where the tendrils tried to dig into her body. But Enel didn't let that dissuade him. The tendrils quickly entangled her, weakening her completely as she was also a devil fruit user. The sea stone impeded her haki as well, which led to her body being pierced in different places and thrown backwards. While this was happening, the other members weren't sleeping. Shiria, Avalo Pizarro and Lafitte all managed to react in time, with the latter two shooting at Enel in a panic and Shiria slicing towards him with his blade. Enel simply parted his body around the attacks. The fact that they were imbued with haki couldn't matter less to him thanks to his observation haki. Shiria, being the closest, was obviously the next target. Enel kicked towards him, his blackened leg hitting Shiria's hilt as the former warden skidded to the side. The former warden was quick to cover his body in armament haki, preparing to tank more hits. Even if he's strong, he won't be able to kill me so quickly. He hoped that the others would be able to hit Enel while he was distracted, but fate had other plans. Enel simply stabbed his staff into the ground, tendrils rising out of the ground and forcing the other Blackbeard pirates to jump backwards. Enel then appeared in front of Shiria, shocking the former warden and putting his palms on each side of the pirate's head. Arcs of lightning danced in between Enel's hand as Shiria screamed in pain, slashing with his blade around in a frenzy, as Enel calmly passed through said blade with ease. After a few seconds, the former jailer had dropped his sword, grasping and clawing at Enel's hands as his head was being cooked thoroughly. Enel simply gave the former warden a cold gaze. "You should have taken my warning in good faith." Enel's words were only heard by Shiria in the former warden's last seconds. With that, Enel dropped the warden's body to the ground. Enel quickly retrieved his staff and looked around at the situation for a bit. The rest of the Blackbeard pirates were trying to flee at that point, with only Van Auger, the sniper, still taking shots at Enel from a distance. And he was rewarded for his efforts, not in a satisfying way for him though. Enel pointed his finger towards a small lightning beam shot directly towards the sniper, who tried to move to the side, but was unable to dodge it in the end. The sniper was pierced in the gut, lightning spreading all over his body as he fell to the floor. "Fucking monster." Avalo Pizarro, the fallen tyrant, shouted as he did his best to flee at his greatest speed. Most of the still conscious Blackbeard pirates had the same thought as they were fleeing. Unfortunately for them, they hadn't managed to make it far, as Enel's lightning moved a lot faster than they ever could. The clouds seemed to snipe them for sport, lightning striking both in their path and to the ground underneath them. The earth was blasted by the lightning strikes, and tremors spread through their surroundings, as Enel was now once again able to give his attention to the Marines. The Whitebeard pirates were holding their own nicely against the Marines. Mihawk was mainly just looking at Enel with interest, as he wasn't all that involved in the war. Marco was once again keeping Kizaru occupied, assisted by a few snipers from his crew. Sengoku was fighting Jozu and Vista, and many of the commanders were holding back vice admirals and admirals. Enel's lighting sometimes fell from the skies, impeding the Marines they were fighting and keeping them on their toes. "Oi! You brat, don't you ignore me." Enel heard a voice in the distance. It was none other than Garp, who was approaching him at breakneck speeds. "Taking a hit won't be that bad, right? For old time's sake." Enel rationalized in his mind as he prepared to clash with a serious Garp for the first time. Enel's staff quickly met Garp's fist, only for the staff to bend in an odd way and for him to be pushed back, breaking another building with his back and being buried in another pile of rubble. Enel didn't bother using his body to leave, he simply turned into lightning and headed straight for the clouds. From the outside, one could see a large lightning beam rising to the skies. Garp tried to follow him using Jeppo but was quickly struck by a lightning bolt, paralyzing him again and sending him hurtling towards the ground with slight burn marks on his skin. At this point, Whitebeard also looked down at his former son, the one he had put his trust into, and the one that had betrayed him. "Teach. I want you to know that I won't ever forgive you." A loving father he was, but he only held one iron rule and Teach had walked all over that. With one last slash of his naginata, Whitebeard sent a powerful quake into the ground, crushing Teach in the process as the former warlord screamed bloody murder. Whitebeard closed his eyes a bit as he delivered the last hit to the one that had betrayed his trust. Blackbeard didn't get to say anything else, his last moment alive was spent screaming as Whitebeard's tremors broke all of the bones in his body and crushed his skull to smithereens. And, just like that, a future emperor of the seas was killed. Finally. It's about time I end this war now, isn't it? Enel thought to himself as his staff started rotating by itself in the air. Chapter 65, War-Ending Move. Point of view narration. Whitebeard heaved a tired sigh as he looked at the body of Teach. The one betrayer of his group, the child that turned against his family. The killer of Tatch, the one that had almost gotten Ace killed as well. Edward Newgate felt strange, although he had avenged his other son, his hands were now dirty with the blood of the one that he had once also considered family. Still, the old man felt that it was better that way. It was better for him to be the one to punish Teach. After all, the one thing he hated to see was his sons harming each other. And, as much as Teach had disappointed him, as much as he had broken the only rule he had made, he was still a son to the old man. Now that he had finally punished Teach, Whitebeard only felt tired. He felt no satisfaction in what he had done after all. How could he? He cared just that much about his children. Which was why he knew that it was time to escape. "My children. All of you. Get back to the ships," Edward said as he shouted with ferocious willpower emanating from him. The Whitebeard pirates listened, and all of them swiftly started fighting their way back to the ship. They all started quickly trying to create a retreating path. The Marines quickly turned more desperate, trying their best to take down any pirate that they could. Sengoku was also getting more and more desperate as the war was looking more and more like a complete loss for the Navy. Each time a high-ranking Marine was close to taking down a pirate, or severely injuring one, a lightning strike always stopped that. It was the same when the pirates got too close to killing a Marine. Although the battle was still ongoing and attacks were being thrown around everywhere, the battle was well and truly caught in a stalemate. And that was all because of Enel, who was currently sitting on a cloud, raining lightning down wherever he could in order to keep that stalemate going. Sengoku was quick to realize that Enel was the one preventing them from winning that battle. He grit his teeth as hate started to well up inside of him. All of the lives lost today. All of that preparation. You're telling me it was for nothing? Sengoku simply couldn't bring himself to cope with that. With an angry roar, he directed his palms at the sky. With inhuman strength, he started releasing shockwave after shockwave towards the skies. Each shockwave parted the clouds more and more. Enel scowled as he tried his best to keep the clouds together, but he had failed in the end. As the sky turned clear, the Marines were starting to regain some morale. This war isn't over yet. We can still win this. As long as Whitebeard falls here. Sengoku was quick to try and motivate his Marines further. However, Enel was getting a bit annoyed at this point. I've rested enough. It's time to end this war. With a simple gesture, he flew towards the water in the middle of the bay. He pointed his arms downwards. Attacks came from all directions, but he simply ignored them, letting them pass through him without any issue. Whether it was magma, light or ice, none of them could injure him as long as he was concentrated enough. With a roar, he started discharging as much electricity as possible into the water. Slowly but surely, the ice around Marineford all melted and the water started rising, pooling to the skies as it sparked with electricity. What is this? Many ships were being pushed away as the pirates that had already retreated were all doing their best to move away from whatever Enel was creating. Stop him. Don't let him charge up and attack. Sengoku shouted as he quickly sent a shockwave towards Enel. He now knew that Enel had a fruit capable of destroying Marineford completely. The last thing he needed was for him to actually do so. Die Funka. Major eruption. Akainu had also jumped towards Enel, his fist erupting forwards as he shot as much magma as he could towards the former rear admiral. Enel managed to notice those attacks as his concentration broke from the move that he was preparing. With a slight scowl, a massive wave of energized water rose from the sea underneath him. The water managed to both cool off Akainu's magma and paralyze him slightly, causing his body to be taken up by the wave and pushed backwards, right into Sengoku's shockwave. The shockwave dispersed the wave, but also injured Akainu. The admiral could only spit out some blood as he fell to the ground. Enel then continued to overcharge the water around him. The energized water was quick to start boiling, as he quickly started to manipulate the seas around Marineford completely. If I can control clouds, then I can control the seas too. With a monstrous amount of concentration and will, Enel quickly started forming a figure using the water that he had energized. Jormungandr. Enel raised his hands upwards as he said that as if summoning something from the depths of the sea. Right on Enel's call, a gigantic snake formed out of the waters he controlled. Its head seemed to be larger than half of Marineford, and its body seemed to have no end as it seemed to be directly connected to the sea. Enel smiled when seeing that his creation had succeeded. He quickly turned into a lightning bolt and tried to enter the snake's body. Kizaru was fast to intercept him, turning into light and appearing in his path. Light and lightning seemed to be flashing around in the sky for a bit as the two of them met in midair and crashed. Both of them kicked at the other. Their kicks connected and Kizaru's strength was shown as he was able to overwhelm Enel after a short few seconds. Enel winced as he felt the bones in his leg crack. He was quickly sent flying backwards, directly into the snake, exactly as he had planned. The second his body hit the snake, it turned into lightning and vanished within the snake. Its eyes seemed to gain a spark, looking like a thunderstorm was happening in each eye at the same time. What the hell is that? One flabbergasted vice admiral muttered as he stared at the impossibly large water construct. Another vice admiral was quick to send a flying slash towards the snake only for the snake to completely part around the slash. How are we supposed to fight something like that? The vice admiral shouted as he tried more and more to send Rankyakis towards the gigantic snake. Many joined him, and countless flying slashes from both legs and blades were sent toward the snake. The Whitebeard pirates were now having to retreat through a different point. Sarquis had turned his boat and actually circled around Marineford in order to pick up Whitebeard. The captains were quick to retreat to it as the attention of the Marines was completely captured by Enel's show. Hancock had also decided to retreat with the Whitebeard pirates. Her interest in the war vanished the second that Luffy managed to escape it. Now, she was only slightly interested in whatever move Enel was cooking up. The snake seemed to deform for a second as the countless slashes pushed away some of the water that formed its body. But the very next second it was completely reformed. How scary. For once, Kizaru's voice didn't have a bored undertone to it. How could it? They were staring the equivalent of an ancient weapon in the eye. Mihawk had yet to leave the battlefield. He quickly swung his sword, a massive flying slash heading directly for the snake's head. The strongest swordsman in the world was intrigued. He wanted to see exactly how the beast in front of him worked. His flying slash was marginally larger than every other before, managing to cut the snake's head off, shocking all of the Marines at the scene. But the shock didn't last long as their fear came back in the next second. The snake's head reconnected itself in that same second, making Mihawk raise an eyebrow. I guess it can't be taken down easily. The swordsman thought to himself as he sent a few more slashes at the snake, each as big as the first one. All of them brushed off in the same manner. The assault continued as everyone seemed to want to stop that snake from slamming itself into Marineford. Aokiji was quick to run towards the water snake, the sweat on his brow freezing as he pointed his hands towards the large snake. Without any hesitation, the admiral jumped directly at the snake. The second they came into contact, Aokiji's eyes widened as the water in front of him seemed to be turning into steam as soon as he came near it. Boiling water. That realization didn't stop him. He forged on, hoping to be able to freeze the snake inside out quickly. But all of the water that he was close to touching seemed to evaporate just as he came close to it. Before he knew it, he was already in the middle of the snake's body, as the steam around him momentarily blinded him. Before he could react, boiling water pushed into him from all sides. The more he froze, the more Enel seemed to be able to melt. The water seemed to form odd currents around him. He tried to lower its temperature endlessly, but each time he froze the water around him even slightly, Enel melted it instantly. The energized water also paralyzed his muscles constantly, making it harder and harder for him to move. In the end, the Ice Admiral was quickly trapped in Enel's water prison, as the snake seemed to form a bubble of still water inside its constantly flowing body. The second the water around Aokiji stilled was also the second his devil fruit powers vanished. He was stuck, just like that. Admiral Aokiji. Many Marines shouted in fear when seeing that development. Okainu was quick to try and blast the snake away, but he didn't get to try many things. The magma that touched the water seemed to only evaporate some of it before quickly being cooled off. It wasn't doing any damage as there was enough water in the ocean to go around. We need to find Enel's true body. Sengoku shouted as he also threw shockwave after shockwave at the snake. But the snake seemed to be a lot tougher than a bunch of clouds. Each time it even slightly deformed, it regenerated instantly. The Marines desperately attacked the snake as the pirate ships were getting pushed further and further by the constantly revolving sea. Whitebeard was already on Sarquis's ship at that point, staring at the gigantic snake as the sea itself seemed to push their ship further away from Marineford. Not one member of the crew could say anything as they stared at the odd scene in front of them. In a sense, it was a beautiful scene. But the fact that the entire thing was the doing of one man seemed to creep out some of them. That brat. He really is a monster. Whitebeard said with a wide smile, no trace of fear on his face. Although Enel's technique was impressive, Whitebeard was not the type to fear anything at all. And he knew that he could likely break it with his quakes if need be. Marco, prepare to fly in and pick up that brat. I doubt he'll have much stamina after pulling a stunt like this. Whitebeard waved his hand, giving his son a direct order without any hesitation. Marco nodded, looking at the gigantic snake with a bit of sweat on his brow. Good thing I didn't try to fight him while on the sea. The commander could still remember his first meeting with Enel. At least Marco had the option to fly away, but he knew that if such an attack was to be directed at his crew in the middle of the sea, many of them would drown. That didn't matter now though. Enel was obviously their ally. Marco couldn't help but feel a bit of pity for the Marines though. Without any warning, the gigantic snake reared back, its head pointed upwards as its throat seemed to be getting larger and larger. Sengoku's eyes widened as he realized what was coming next. Flood incoming. Brace yourselves. That was all the warning that the Marines got as the snake quickly pointed its head towards Marineford. The snake seemed to start spitting out the contents of its stomach, creating a massive wave of boiling water that swallowed half of Marineford. The water seemed to break down the walls of Marineford rather quickly. The powerful stream swept away everything in its path. Sengoku used his massive body to create a shield for the Marines behind him, blasting shockwave after shockwave into that tidal wave, but the tide didn't stop for anything. Kizaru tried to send explosive blasts toward the tide and the snake's head, only managing to halt it for a few milliseconds as the jet stream of water blasted throughout the entire island. Aokiji also got spat out in that attack, landing somewhere off to the side as the tides pushed against his body. But the second he was no longer in still water, he started freezing the waters around him. This time, he did so successfully, managing to freeze most of the wave, and the snake that had created it. Aokiji was a bit shocked at having succeeded, as he had expected Enel to melt his ice instantly again. But nothing had happened. The Marines looked around as the tides around them seemed to die down. Sengoku broke some of the ice stuck to his body as he looked around in a rage. Where did he go? The fleet admiral asked as he looked at Kizaru. The light admiral simply shook his head, signaling that he had no clue either. And, just like that, all that the Marines had gained in that war was the giant ice sculpture of a snake, much larger than Marineford itself. Chapter 66. Exhaustion and Waves. Point of view narration. Enel abandoned the snake's body as soon as the Whitebeard pirates got far enough from Marineford. It took everything from him to sometimes check on them, as controlling the large snake he had created was already taking up most of his concentration. Still, he had managed to do it in the end. Jormungandr was the name he had given to that move. It was extremely useful against a large number of enemies, but it didn't really have much of an effect on stronger people. Sengoku didn't have any issues with taking on the tides with his body, and most of the vice admirals and rear admirals could also easily withstand it as long as they had armament haki. There was the issue of being washed into the sea and drowning, but this wasn't a problem for non-devil fruit users. Enel was now resting on a cloud a bit further away from Marineford. That was about as far as he could make it. He had been injured that entire time, ever since the clash with Whitebeard. His hands had taken the worst beating in that war. He had used his staff to block attacks from many powerful marines. His leg was also most likely broken from Kizaru's kick, which Enel had honestly expected, so he couldn't complain. Getting Kizaru to kick him towards the snake was honestly the only way for him to enter it. The Light Admiral would have otherwise been able to stop him from entering it by constantly intercepting him. Not that he knew that Enel would just disappear in it. Still, Enel didn't even feel like he had enough energy to keep his eyes open, but he knew he couldn't fall asleep on a cloud. The only reason he could rest on one was that he had overcharged it and compressed it enough for him to sit on. Enel could feel his consciousness slipping, but he also knew that he couldn't exactly pass out that close to Marineford and above the sea. The sea would likely swallow him, and if the Marines did find him, he'd just be imprisoned. Still, he couldn't help it. The crippling exhaustion that filled his body. In a moment of carelessness, Enel's control on the cloud underneath him actually slipped. Enel scowled a bit as he was free falling towards the sea. I didn't want to do this, but I guess I've no choice now. Just as he was about to turn into lightning and use his greatest speed to fly off with his last sparks of stamina, he saw a blue figure quickly approaching him. It didn't even take a few seconds for him to be caught in a pair of talons. Enel looked up to see the face of a familiar blue phoenix with bored-looking round eyes. Are you alright, Enel Yoy? Marco said as he instantly turned back around and flew back towards their ships at the greatest speed he could muster, this time with Enel within his grasp. Been better. Enel said with a wry smile. He was a bit shocked to hear just how weak his voice sounded. The last thing Enel could remember was Marco's cheeky smile as he passed out. At least they won't be executing me, Enel thought to himself as his consciousness slipped. While the Whitebeard pirates were still fleeing, the Marines were recovering from Enel's attack. Most of Marineford had been flooded, and they also had a lot of people to fish out of the waters and break out of Okiji's ice. Sengoku could feel a headache coming to him as he realized that their pathetic loss had all been televised to the world. Although he had asked for the broadcast to be stopped at some point, it still continued as some pirates had found the recording device pointing at the stage. Sengoku ripped some of his hair out in frustration as he tried to reason with himself. He could only find it in himself to blame one person for his failure. Enel. Whatever your reason was, I won't forgive you for this. Sengoku's anger could hardly be quelled. Garp could only sigh as he took off his coat and started drying it off. That brat really went and did it, huh? The old man thought to himself, suppressing a smile as he realized that both of his grandsons had survived the ordeal. Okainu was surprisingly not as angry as Sengoku. The most prevalent emotion inside him was currently confusion. He simply refused to believe that Enel was a dirty criminal. He knew that the rear admiral had been temperamental and that he had always been a bit prone to insubordination. But Akainu also knew that Enel had a strong sense of justice, unwavering even, that thing one simply couldn't fake. Enel went out of his way to hunt pirates and even got into trouble with the world government in order to dispense justice. Akainu knew that Enel didn't gain anything from those situations, yet he still chose to put himself in them. Akainu had respected that part of Enel. Now he wasn't sure what to feel anymore. I will definitely be the one to catch him. He better have a good reason for this when I do. That was all he could think about as he huffed to himself. His thoughts were somewhat similar to that of Hina actually, who was just as confused and angry as him. She internally vowed to capture him and force his reasons out of him. She needed to find out if all of it had been a lie, and if their friendship was also a lie. To her, it hadn't been one, but she couldn't be sure if it was the same for Enel anymore. Although the Marines had lost the war in its entirety, the world government had lost just as much. Not even a day passed since the war ended, and Sengoku was already replaced by Akainu, being forced to resign as the brunt of the mistakes was blamed on him. The Marines were also forced to start moving their main base, the Holy Land Marijuas, as Marineford needed to be completely rebuilt, and the world government decided to just move the Marine base closer to the Celestial Dragons. This had everything to do with the fact that Enel was still at large, and the five elders wanted to assure that the Celestial Dragons were well protected. Akainu was rather mad about that major change, but he couldn't exactly argue with the reasoning. The problem was, that now the brunt of the Navy as an organization was delegated to protecting the world government in its entirety. Basically, everything above a rear admiral needed to protect the celestial dragons at all times and were ordered to be stationed inside the Holy Land at all times. This was done extremely quickly after the war, and the Marines were still recovering, so no one had any time to dispute these orders. Still, Akainu wasn't stupid enough to not realize that many Marines would likely be forced to resign. He had already been around plenty of celestial dragons, so he knew that they weren't going to be accommodating to others. But that problem would be addressed at another time. Right now, Akainu needed to handle the logistics of both moving their main base and recovering from the war at the same time. Surprisingly, Okiji decided not to put more salt on the wound and try to dispute Akainu's position. Instead, the Ice Admiral started helping Akainu with the paperwork. The world itself was shaken by the war. No one had expected things to go the way they had. Not only that, the entire world now knew that Portugues de Ace was the last living blood relative of Gol D. Roger. And, unlike his father, the Marines had completely failed to execute Ace, and his whereabouts were now completely unknown. Then there was Enel. The unranked admiral, as some had called him after the Dressrosa incident, was formally stripped of all of his achievements and rank. He was shunned by the world government for his efforts to save a pirate as vile as Roger's spawn. With this event, Enel had proven his strength to the world, striking fear in the hearts of many with the rise of yet another extremely dangerous pirate. With this, he also gained the full attention of the world government, becoming yet another enemy they had to worry about and take countermeasures against. Chapter 67, Unanswered Questions and Waking Up. Point of View Narration. The first thing Enel saw when he opened his eyes was light. Then the light became stars as more and more of them seemed to pop out around him. It didn't take long for Enel to realize that he hadn't actually woken up yet. Looking around, he could see many planets in the distance, many stars flowing in the rivers of the universe. But why was he dreaming about that? I never understood this. Why do humans feel the need to dream? Enel was shocked, instantly turning his head to the voice. He could see it, a pair of red eyes staring at him. Familiar, yet completely alien. Enel controlled his body, coming closer and closer to that voice until he could finally make it out. The form of a middle-aged man with black hair, a small stubble and deep red eyes. The man was also wearing a formal suit, looking like he was preparing to leave for a fancy party. Enel's eyes widened a bit as he recognized that form. How couldn't he? He had looked like that for most of his life. Why are you here? And why do you look like me? Enel asked as his face turned a bit grave. He didn't know what to expect for an answer, but he certainly hoped for something, anything. Like you. No, you no longer look like this. You abandoned your old life, taking on a different form. The voice of the older man seemed to echo in the universe around them as Enel narrowed his eyes at the strange god's proclamation. Enel looked at the god with a blank gaze, not knowing exactly what to say to that. I have always been curious about your species. I fail to understand it even after so many years. What is ambition? The god tilted his head once more as its red eyes peered into Enel. Rather basic, that one. Ambition refers to one's strong desire to achieve something meaningful, to accomplish something great. Enel crossed his arms, deciding to humor the god in front of him. Not that he had many choices at hand. It was either that or try to run away, which didn't even seem like an option, honestly. Basic indeed. Simple-minded and strange to hear from someone like you. The god seemed unimpressed with the answer, which made Enel scowl a bit. What do you want me to say? That's the literal definition of it. What do I want you to say? My bad. I guess I should have worded that better. What is ambition to you? The god's eyes sparked a bit. Enel stared at his former body's emotionless face for a bit. I forgot this thing can read my thoughts. Ambition is what drives me forward. Enel's words were stopped instantly as he instinctively felt something grip his heart. It was as if his heart was placed in a vice, and Enel could feel himself squirming. Don't lie to me, the god said without any change in expression. Ambition doesn't mean anything. Nothing more than a way to trick yourself that you are doing something meaningful with your time. Enel ended up saying as he clutched his chest a bit. Saying exactly what the god wanted to hear, regardless of what he felt. Indeed. You know that. You are smart. Nothing that you do will ever have any effect on the world. All humans always end up as nothing more than buried bones. So why bother with all this? Images started flashing around Enel when the god said that, memories of his time in the world of One Piece. From helping the Sky People indirectly to joining the Marines, freeing Dressrosa and eventually betraying the Marines. All of those scenes passed by as Enel looked on with a raised eyebrow. I wanted to do it. Either due to curiosity or to achieve something. Or due to rage and other emotions. Enel said as he looked over the strips of memories that surrounded him. So strange. I don't remember you being so impulsive. The god said as a smile cracked on its face. You never knew me that well, I guess. Most of what I used to do was on impulse. It's the same for most humans. Enel said as looked at the memories vanishing around him, revealing the stars once more. Humans are so weird. The god said before shaking its head. Enel just scowled again. He opened his mouth, hoping to get to ask some questions of his own. The main one on his mind was, what did you do to my soul? The god could clearly hear his thoughts, but it also certainly didn't care to answer. I guess I should get to the real question. Why are you here? The god tilted its head. Enel could see its humanoid neck crack. Its eyes seemed to retract inside its head, revealing two black holes emptily staring at Enel. A strange black sludge seemed to start spilling out of its mouth, eye holes and quickly cracking skin. Enel tried to move, but he simply couldn't control his body. The sludge quickly filled all of the space around him as his vision became more and more blurry with each second that passed. The next second, he forced his eyes open, shooting up from his bed in a panic as he took in deep breaths. He managed to calm down rather quickly as the air filling his lungs managed to cool down his head as well. And just like that, I'm back, huh? Enel looked around the room. He could see that he was in a small room, most likely on Whitebeard's ship. Why was I even there in the first place? Still, Enel knew that he wouldn't gain anything by simply pondering on that forever. He had other things to do currently. The good sign was that he wasn't wearing any cuffs / wasn't restrained in any way. I guess I managed to befriend them in the end. Still, I can't make it seem like this was my goal originally. It would certainly make things worse. Enel looked to the side. His white staff and golden gauntlets seemed to be leaning on a wall nearby. The doctor probably took them off him at some point. His clothes were also folded and placed near his bed. Both of his arms had been broken in the war, but Enel knew he'd survive. His leg was also bandaged. Thankfully it wasn't anywhere near as battered as his arms were. The first thing Enel did was to get up and put his shirt back on, rolling up its sleeves in the process. He no longer had a jacket as that had been ripped to pieces at some point during the scuffle. His marine coat was still there, a bit tattered, but Enel decided to wear it for now, as it had somewhat become part of his style. The next thing he did was to put the gauntlets on his damaged hands, tightening them as much as possible to keep his bones arranged at all times. Then he ended up putting the staff on his back. Enel walked out of the room and onto the deck, opening the door with one of his earlobes as his arms hung limply to his sides. They were currently on the high seas. Enel could hear shouts and music all around him, pirates dancing and drinking. They had successfully escaped. That much was obvious. The pirates seemed to notice him leaving his room. They seemed to still be a bit weary of him, but not to the point where they'd stop partying. Enel yoy. Good to see you're up. Pops was calling for you. Marco walked over to Enel while drinking from a sake bottle directly. Sure thing. The former rear admiral said as he started walking towards the figurehead of the ship, where he could feel the large man resting. Whitebeard was bandaged up all over as he had also sustained plenty of injuries. He was also hooked up to various tubes due to his illness, but that didn't seem to stop him from drinking sake directly from a barrel. Whitebeard smiled a bit when seeing Enel approaching him. Most of his crew members made way for Enel, looking at him with a bit of fear. The captains didn't seem scared though, they were mostly just looking at Enel with some wariness. But at this point, none of them would even attempt to stop him from approaching their father. Everyone had seen Enel protecting Whitebeard during the war, both from the Marines and from Blackbeard's crew. At this point, thinking that Enel wanted to harm Whitebeard would be rather strange. Enel, glad to see you moving around already, Whitebeard said with a wide smile. It was clear that the old man didn't mind being able to still party with his children as opposed to being killed in the war. Yeah, my arms are still broken thanks to you. But I'll be fine, Enel said as he waved one of his earlobes around. They would act as his limbs until his actual hands healed. Good thing they were long enough to go to his waist. Grrrra. Whitebeard laughed loudly, slapping his knee as his laugh then turned into a coughing fit. Might want to take it slowly on the drinking, old man. You're already injured and sickly enough. Enel said as he made a chair with his staff and sat down with his legs crossed in front of the large pirate. Don't tell me what to do now, this is a joyous occasion. Newgate said as he smiled and took another sip from his barrel. I guess a bit of celebration never hurt anybody, Enel said as he arched his earlobes, making it look like he was shrugging with them. Ace is safe, I am still alive enough to enjoy the company of my children. Things couldn't have been better, honestly. The legendary pirate spoke while looking at his crew with a tired gaze. This entire celebration, it's only happening thanks to you. Whitebeard put down his barrel for a second, looking Enel in the eye as his face turned a bit serious. I had stepped on that field prepared to lose my life. Actually, returning was never a possibility in my mind. The old man rubbed one of his knees while sighing a bit. Enel let him speak, also a bit curious about what his thoughts were but also knowing that it would be rude to interrupt the old man. I was convinced that I would die either to the Marines or to teach when he appeared. But it seems that fate had other plans. Whitebeard picked his barrel back up, taking another sip. I don't know what your purpose was, or why you helped us the way you did. But I have you to thank for the smiles that my children are currently displaying. Whitebeard continued to speak as Enel heaved a sigh. I guess I should try to make my true intentions a bit more transparent. Chapter 68, Lies, Truth and Reaction. Point of view narration. And so, Enel looked at the old pirate for a few seconds. Then he opened his mouth and started speaking. Honestly, at first I only wanted to protect Luffy. Enel said as he stretched his earlobe and grabbed a bottle of sake for himself. I could tell. That kid certainly has a way with people, huh? Whitebeard said with a smile of his own. That much is obvious, isn't it? Enel said as he raised his bottle with his earlobe and took another sip. But I was also doing good old Garp a favor. You could probably tell from the way he let Luffy pass him by, but he really wanted Ace to survive that. Enel said as he looked a bit at the sea, catching a glimpse of the sunset in the distance. Whitebeard nodded a bit, he knew just how tough the marine hero was. Luffy had no hope of actually downing him as he was now. I can understand that. But how'd you end up betraying the Marines completely and even helping me? Whitebeard raised an eyebrow while asking that question. He wasn't about to start accusing his benefactor, but Enel's actions did deserve to be at least somewhat questioned. Meh, in for a penny, in for a pound, I figured, Enel said as he shrugged his earlobes again, spilling a few drops of sake on the deck. Whitebeard just looked confused, not really understanding the idiom that Enel was trying to use. Basically, if I'm already doing it, might as well go all out. I betrayed the Marines the second I got in front of a canoe. At that point, making an enemy out of you and your crew wouldn't have really helped me in any way. I can understand that, Whitebeard said as he took another sip of his barrel. But at the same time, you could have easily let me die and give the Marines some semblance of victory in this war. My children wouldn't have any right to accuse you, as you had saved Ace. Whitebeard said as his eyes narrowed a bit. Maybe. But letting you die simply no longer made any sense at that point. You should be well aware that I've not been a Marine for long. Not exactly accustomed to all of their rules yet. Enel just had a wry smile on his face as he wondered if Whitebeard would believe him in the end. Whitebeard looked at Enel for a bit, his narrowed eyes studying the former rear admiral for a few seconds. In the end, the old pirate simply started laughing out loud. Minus ending in yet another coughing fit that had the party momentarily stop as all of the crew members looked at Newgate with a worried gaze. Maybe you shouldn't be fighting this much at your age. You sound like you're close to coughing your lungs out. Enel said as he intertwined his earlobes in a similar manner in which he would usually cross his arms. Shut it, brat. I'm still healthy enough to punch you to the bottom of the sea. Whitebeard said with renowned energy, making Enel sweat a bit. Huh? What's with this silence? Bring me more sake. The party restarted in that instant, with Whitebeard's children quickly bringing him another barrel and returning to dancing around on the deck. Where the hell do these pirates get this much energy? Enel could remember the celebration they had in Dressrosa, that was so much tamer compared to the party the pirates were throwing among each other. By the way, Whitebeard. Where are Ace and Luffy? Figured they'd be traveling with you. Enel said as he also fetched himself yet another drink. Ace and his brother are probably still with the doctor. He came at the perfect moment, It's also difficult for the Marines to catch a submarine. Enel Yoy Marco came along this time, giving an answer rather swiftly. It doesn't matter where Ace is. As long as he is safe, I am content. Whitebeard said, his lips turned upwards, forming a wide smile. Indeed. As long as they are safe, I also don't particularly care. I'm sure Garp feels the same. Enel took another sip of his drink, looking at Marco for a few seconds. By the way, are you going to keep wearing the coat? Whitebeard asked with a wry smile while staring at Enel's back. I guess not. I'll have to get another one, not Marine sanctioned. Enel looked at the epaulets that adorned each of his shoulders. He blinked for a few seconds before reaching out to them and ripping them off his coat. Better than throwing it away, I guess. Enel said as he simply threw the epaulets overboard, not giving them even a second glance. No, it's really tattered. You might want to go shopping for some new clothes, honestly, Yoy. Marco said with a small laugh. Enel just stared at him with narrowed eyes, before simply shrugging his earlobes and going back to drinking. Partying for a few days and recovering with the Whitebeard pirates doesn't sound so bad. And, just like that, Enel had a set course for the following days. He proceeded to get completely shit-faced and dance around with the crew. Not one person looked at him with weariness after he spoke with Whitebeard. Now he was just like a regular friend. After all, he had saved Whitebeard and Ace, he was as good as family to them now. Eventually, a bird came around and delivered the newspaper. It was a huge hit piece on Enel basically. The world government had certainly tried their best to paint Enel worse and worse with each article. A page in the newspaper was rather interesting though, and Enel had apparently gained an epithet to go with it. Much like Kato was called the King of the Beasts and Charlotte Linlin was called Big Mom or Queen of Todo Land. Enel became known as the Sky King Enel. The photo captured of him was also rather fitting. With him just sitting on a cloud cross-legged with his staff over one of his shoulders with a sparking gauntleted palm pointing towards the ground, a lazy gaze and a slight smile on his face. His bounty was not low, not by any stretch of the imagination. Befitting his epithet, he received the bounty of 3 billion berry, wanted dead, not alive. Becoming the first man to receive such a major bounty on his first evaluation. To preserve their reputation, the world government would have done everything possible to hide Enel's betrayal and hunt him down covertly. But since everything was televised, they weren't able to do anything about it. Now, instead of being called the unranked admiral, the newspapers started calling him the unranked emperor. Many large figures and powerful pirates wanted to mock the decision of the press to call Enel a Yonko. But when seeing the footage of Enel holding back the entirety of the navy, as well as footage of Jormungandr, those critics were silenced rather quickly. The betrayal of Enel was quickly dramatized beyond imagination as the world government worked overnight to vilify Enel as much as possible. Although he was called both the unranked emperor and the rookie emperor, it didn't seem that the government had given him the title officially though. Everyone seemed rather shocked about it, but Enel didn't seem to care that much. The Whitebeard pirates could only laugh when seeing the half-drunk Enel wipe his nose with the newspaper and throw it overboard. The rest of the world was still shaking though. When the news reached Big Mom's territory, plenty of people had different reactions. Big Mom didn't seem all that surprised, she also didn't seem to care much about fighting Enel. The reveal of his Goro Goro no Mi did surprise her a bit and rouse her curiosity, but not to the point where she would want to meet him again. Katekuri was shocked though, realizing that it was likely a good thing Enel didn't fight them that day, as many of his siblings would have certainly died. Oven wasn't exactly shocked per se, he just felt that the world government was being really scummy about the way they portrayed Enel. He already knew the former rear admiral personally, so he knew what type of person Enel was. Still, Enel's jacked bounty only made him want to grow even stronger. He didn't let that dissuade him one bit. He was already a wanted criminal, so he had no qualms about befriending Enel. But the Riku royal family was a bit different. All of them were shocked by that turn of events. They all knew Enel, and they didn't buy the story about him being some cold-blooded animal. But the fact that he had become such a high-profile criminal was concerning. Viola wasn't exactly shocked by him being able to become an emperor in the public eye, as she already knew he was strong. But she also knew he wasn't a criminal, which confused her quite a bit. In the end, she, as well as the rest of her family, could only hope that Enel would visit them and explain things at some point. The Straw Hats also had various reactions to that news. Most of them were rather focused on the fact that their captain's brother was to be executed. Many of them remembered Enel, even Frankie and Brooke had heard about him at some point. Either from Luffy, talking about his long ears, or from Sanji, talking about his speed. All of them had received the message from their captain though, that they'd have to meet again in 2 years. And, seeing the recording and photos of the Marineford War managed to light a fire underneath them. Zoro especially. If I want to be of assistance to Luffy in the future, I can't afford to be this weak. Zoro was affected quite a bit by the way Kuma had managed to dispatch them on the Sabati archipelago. Now he had also caught a glimpse of just how overwhelming fights at the top level were. If I truly want to be the right hand of the king, then I need to grow stronger. Much stronger. Sanji also had similar thoughts. He was one of the crew's main fighters, despite being the cook. He had already been humbled once by Enel during their visit to the Sky Islands, but actually seeing how strong the top powers of the world were made him feel strangely inadequate. Therefore, he knew that he would need to become a lot stronger if he wanted to be able to protect his friends. His sentiments were mirrored by the majority of the Straw Hats. All of them wanting to become better in order to be able to help Luffy achieve his goals. Chapter 69, Next Steps and Support. Point of View Enel. After a few days of celebration, I also started getting tired. The Whitebeard pirates seem to still be going strong, but I do need to take a break and think about my next steps. I have plenty of things I wish to accomplish. But I also have a lot of time from now on. Nothing is rushing me as gaining allies was the most important part of my plan at first. Getting a bounty on my head was somewhat expected. I didn't think it would be that high, but I guess it does make sense. It's not really just about betraying the Marines and fighting the Navy forces, not even me saving Whitebeard is that important to them. The old guy would just die of his sickness in a year or two. The gravest thing I've done was save Ace during this war. The world government had set up that huge spectacle with Sengoku revealing Ace's identity with the sole purpose to execute him and make a statement that the age of pirates was over. I remember Whitebeard ruining that by shouting that the One Piece was true in the original, but that is no longer needed. The Navy, and by extension the world government, suffered massive losses and both reputation and influence from this event. If anything, the Navy's grip somewhat weakening due to this war will only create more pirates. I'm sure Sengoku did envision the possibility of losing the war, so the world government surely has some tricks up their sleeve and some countermeasures to combat the rise in piracy. Now that I think about it, I think they are trying to turn me into a detrimental factor for pirates. A new possible Yonko rising, one that loathes both pirates and Marines equally. That's how they titled me and what type of propaganda they're spreading. They think that another possible Yonko that hates pirates might dissuade idiots from throwing themselves at the sea in hopes of riches and fame. That's just a stupid assumption to make. In truth, most Yonkos couldn't care less about other pirates as long as they don't interfere with whatever business they happen to run. If anything, making me an emperor will just inspire more people to become pirates and challenge me. As is the case for all of the others' emperors. Weaklings will either challenge me or beg to join my crew. So, this might be the government shooting themselves in the foot. Or not really. It's easy for a CP0 agent to slip into my crew if I get a surplus of new recruits. That's likely what they're hoping would happen. Honestly, I might not even get that many challenges. I'm not even an official Yonko. They'd have to change the name if they were to also give me a similar title. After all, Yonko refers to the 4 emperors. Newgate might not have a lot of time left, but he's still around, so there are already 4 of them. So, although the world government are spreading propaganda about me being a Yonko, they haven't actually given me that title officially, and probably won't ever. To be fair, acknowledging the existence of yet another threat to their influence and power to the world publicly after such a huge failure in the war is likely not something that they can afford to do. Right now, I'm just considered a powerful and vile criminal. Being called a possible emperor only refers to my strength. Still, I could likely force their hand to change the Yonko into the Goatee 5 emperors. I'd have to swallow up some territory in the New World, and I'd basically have a foothold to call myself one. Problem is that I also don't really have any crew. Without a crew, I may be strong, but I won't be able to stretch my influence endlessly if I only have my own strength to rely on. Regardless, I don't really care about becoming an emperor or recruiting a pirate crew for now. Getting a bounty of 3 billion is already enough for me. Now, after the war, my original plan was to try and see how I'd get into contact with the Revolutionary Army. I think I can remember their base being at Boltego. They also don't exactly recruit people as freely as the Marines do. If they did, then they'd honestly just be filled with CP agents. The actual kicker is that the location of Boltego is not known to anyone outside the Revolutionary Army. So if I want to find it, I'd have to first try to contact them covertly. Regardless, I could have thought of ways to get in touch with them. Tracking down Ivankov after the war wouldn't have been impossible. But, right now I also feel the need to look into souls a bit more. I can't exactly pretend that my Conqueror's hacky situation doesn't bother me. That god seemed awfully interested in me, so I need to find out more about it. The god seemed able to visit me in my dreams. But I am starting to think that it doesn't have as much influence over the world physically. Can't be too sure, but I think it would have gotten in the way of a few of my plans if it could. It seems to have a path that it wants me to take. For some reason, that god also has something against humans. I even needed to play by its rules and say whatever it wanted to hear while in that dream, but lying to a god is difficult, especially when said god can read your thoughts. Maybe this world holds some knowledge regarding that. Where do I even start though? There are plenty of religions in this world. I'd need to have access to a huge library if I wanted to look into more of them. Even then, there is no guarantee that I'd find anything. I think the best course of action for me would still be to touch up with the Revolutionary Army. I think I have the perfect ticket to get them too. But I also have another small nuisance to deal with first. Well, good thing I have the time to deal with everything. Point of view narration. With his next steps thought up, Enel finally went to sleep for a bit more. This time everything was normal, he didn't dream. He simply rested his eyes and woke up in the morning. At this point, the Whitebeard pirates were also sleeping by the hundreds. Enel tiptoed around the pirates laying and sleeping on the deck of his ship, heading for Whitebeard. After all, it was rude for a guest to leave without letting the host know. Edward Newgate was awake, an early bird by the looks of it. The old man also looked at Enel as if he had been expecting the former rear admiral to show up. Figured you'd show up. You seemed the type to leave the party early in the morning. Whitebeard said with a wide smile. I don't want to hear that. You people have way too much energy. Seriously, for an old guy on his deathbed, you sure have a lot more stamina than me. Enel simply shook his head, which made the old man chuckle a bit. Deathbed or not, I am still Whitebeard. Though, I probably don't have much time left. Whitebeard looked at his crewmates, his children all sprawled on the ground, likely all suffering from alcohol poisoning of varying severity. Enel, I'll be honest with you. I don't even know if I'll get to see you again in this life of mine. Nougat's voice was resolute, no trace of fear for his imminent doom was to be found. I want you to know that you can rely on my children in the future for anything. Here, a piece of Marco's Vivre card. If you need help, get in touch with him. Whitebeard handed Enel a small piece of paper. The former rear admiral looked at it for a bit and stuffed it in his pocket. Enel raised an eyebrow at that. It was his goal to have the Whitebeard pirates as allies. But he didn't expect to hear those words directly from the captain's mouth. Don't you dare take advantage of them though. I'll rise out of my grave and beat you to death if you do. Enel just sweated a bit at that. The old guy still has some spunk in him. He isn't called the strongest for no reason, I guess. Don't worry. I hopefully won't ever need help with anything. But I'll remember your words in the future. Enel simply shook his head in the end, as his body slowly started floating. It was nice meeting you, old man. I hope our paths cross again in the future, if not then it was an honor to get drunk alongside you these past few days. Enel said with a smile. Grrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr knee as he started laughing, waking up some of his children in the process, all of which seemed to have a hangover. I don't appreciate the slander. I only fell asleep momentarily. Underneath the table, Enel said as he crossed his arms in indignation. Buzz off, you brat. Whitebeard said as he waved his hand a bit. Enel simply smiled, turning into a bolt of lightning and rushing into the clouds. Whitebeard looked at the sky with a smile. Pops, did Enel leave? He didn't even say goodbye to me, yoy. Marco woke up and said while blinking a few times in tiredness. Go back to sleep, you brats. We all know you don't like mornings. Whitebeard said as he stared at his children with a smile on his lips. Enel. It doesn't matter if you are to face the world, I'll make sure you are not alone. Just like you made sure I'd be able to spend my last days with my children. Chapter 70, Capture and Diplomacy. Point of view narration. Enel traveled from cloud to cloud, looking for his destination. The first thing he quickly needed to do was to look for a certain pirate. Jewelry Bonney was technically not supposed to be kidnapped anymore, but Enel wanted to make sure nothing bad would happen. Blackbeard was dead, but Enel also knew that Bonney was far from being prepared to venture into the new world, much like the rest of the worst generation. He knew that, as long as she was allowed to roam around the world freely, then the world government had the possibility to get their hands on her. He simply couldn't allow something like that to happen, so he simply started jumping from cloud to cloud, heading directly towards the beginning of the new world. Enel spent a few hours traveling like that. He sunk a few pirate ships out of boredom, sniping them with lightning from the clouds. In the end, he finally caught sight of Jewelry Bonney. Surprisingly though, she was not on her own ship. Bonney had set sail with her crew right after watching the war from Sabati Archipelago. She had thankfully managed to hide from the Marines that had stormed the island after Luffy's attack on a celestial dragon. She also got to experience the war in all of its glory, finding out more about how strong people could get in the world. Despite her age and fruit, she was still not that accustomed to the world's powers. She knew about them, but she had rarely gotten to see them in action. Still, she felt that she was prepared to go further into the new world to grow stronger in her journey. Unfortunately for her, the timing she chose couldn't have been worse, as the Marines were currently moving base to Marijuas, which just so happened to be extremely close to Sabati. The moment she set sail, she was quickly followed by 4 different Marine warships kitted to sail on the calm belt at speeds far greater than her own ship. She also had just gotten her ship coated, and a stray cannonball from a Marine ship had both ruined her coating and made her completely unable to go to Fishman Island by extension. She could only curse loudly as she was forced to sail further and further into the new world, going in blind as the Marine ships seemed to trail closely behind her. And, suddenly, just when she thought they had a chance to escape, another ship came along, right in front of her. Being disoriented by the odd weather of the Grand Line, and not having a set direction she could go towards, she had ended up going somewhat towards the former Marine base, Marineford. And, just as she was shouting orders to turn the ship around, the entire sea froze solid, completely trapping her ship as a tall figure started making its way towards her ship. Fuck me, this isn't happening. Bonney could instantly recognize the person. It was none other than Okiji, the admiral that had played a huge role during Marineford, also considered the one to have managed to stop the Sky King's devastating attack on the Marine base. Okiji was credited as the one to have routed Enel during the war, but the Ice Admiral knew better, as he had been completely unable to freeze the snake and had even gotten trapped within it. However, the rest of the world didn't need to know that. The world government did their best to rationalize that the Marines had fought the hardest during the war and that the pirates had escaped through sheer luck. Making Okiji the hero of said war was a way to take some attention away from the fact that it was a complete loss for the Marines. Still, now Bonney had to somehow face off against the supposed hero of the Summit War, who also happened to be an admiral and someone that could freeze the sea instantly. The situation developed about as most people would have expected it to. Okiji froze most of her crew alive and captured her, as she was a special prisoner that was only wanted alive by the world government. Bonney was brought on the ship, guarded by Okiji as they started making their way for the Holy Land of the Celestial Dragons once more. That was about the time Enel flew into the frame, zipping around in the clouds as he observed the situation below him. He could tell that Okiji was present, but beside him, there were also a few rear admirals and even 2 vice admirals. There were also 4 other warships nearby, which were turning away to continue heading for Marijuas. Enel decided on a course of action rather quickly. I can't let the world government get their hands on her. He quickly turned into a bolt of lightning and hit their bowsprit directly, breaking it off completely as Enel stepped onto the deck with a calm smile. The Marines were immediately alarmed as there were not even any storm clouds around when the lightning hit their ship. The actual panic set in when seeing who had attacked them. Its former Rear Admiral Enel. Many of the Marines had yet to start calling Enel by his epithet of Sky King. The betrayal was still fresh, and many had considered him a true Marine in the short time he had been with them. Seeing him freely attack a Marine warship right after Marineford was not something they had expected. It also wasn't something anyone on board wanted. The Marines quickly formed a circle around Enel, grasping at their weapons in desperation, as Enel simply smiled at them. Even the rear admirals panicked in the same way as the regular soldiers, only the vice admirals and Okiji himself were keeping their cool. He must want something. Okiji stepped forward, raising his arm and signaling his men to back off for now. Sky King Enel. To what do we owe the pleasure? At this point, Aokiji knew that fighting Enel while at sea was simply impossible. A stray lighting beam from Enel would likely sink their ship instantly. They were in the middle of the sea. Aokiji was rather confident in fighting Enel as he was an admiral. But he knew his crewmates would all most likely die in the process. Wanting to save his crew, Aokiji decided to take a diplomatic approach for now. Aokiji, great to see you again, actually. Enel said as he patted the dust off of his clothes and tattered cape. As you might have guessed, I am here because I need something from this ship, Enel said as he crossed his arms and looked at the Marines with a smile. Aokiji could tell that Enel's words were rousing anger in the Marines around them. Many of them felt that Enel shouldn't even have the guts to show up near the Marines anymore. Seeing him come to them and ask for something felt insulting to them. Aokiji didn't seem bothered by it, he just hoped that the rest of the Marines wouldn't act in anger and get themselves killed. Although the world government didn't like to admit it, Enel was currently an emperor. So Aokiji knew he needed to handle the situation delicately. They simply couldn't afford a war with Enel so soon after Marineford. And what might that be? We aren't carrying any special cargo to speak of. Aokiji said as he realized that Enel was most likely referring to Jewelry Bonney, the woman that the world government wanted for undisclosed reasons. Oh, no need to be coy about it, Aokiji. Bonney comes with me, and I'll leave you all alone. That's it, I don't need anything more and I don't want to kill anyone to prove a point. Enel said as he sighed a bit. He hoped that his request would be fulfilled, but he knew that it was unlikely judging by the reactions of the Marines around Aokiji. Fine. Surprisingly, the Ice Admiral agreed instantly, shocking his subordinates instantly. Admiral Aokiji. We can't accept the demands of this criminal. A Rear Admiral said as he looked at Enel with pure anger in his gaze. Why yes. He has no right to ask us for anything. More and more. Marines joined in, voicing their distaste for Aokiji's decision. Honestly, if any other of the admirals were here, they would have fought Enel without caring about the rest of the crew. But Aokiji also didn't happen to put a lot of value on the request of the 5 elders to bring Bonney in. To him, giving a pirate with a low bounty away for the life of his crewmates was a great trade-off. But still, with so many people voicing out their distaste, they were at an impasse. Aokiji sweated a bit as he wondered what to do next.